Miss Marple and the Case of the Third Invitations. Chapter 1. The Garden That Knew Too Much. It was one of those unusually warm spring afternoons in the village of Alderlodge, just the sort of day where bees hummed lazily over wisteria, and the vicar's wife began her yearly battle with sunburn. The garden at the Laurels, belonging to the recently widowed Mrs. Mildred Fanshawe, was in full bloom. Delicate foxgloves lined a hedge, and the scent of peonies hung sweetly in the air as a modest crowd gathered for her annual tea and croquet afternoon, an event that had grown slightly more ostentatious each year since the late Mr. Fanshawe's departure from this world. Mrs. Fanshawe, woman of 60, with an abundance of lavender perfume and social ambition, had invited what she referred to as a balanced gathering, meaning a precise mixture of old village stalwarts, potential suitors, visiting relatives, and one or two people she disliked just enough to keep the afternoon interesting. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a white-painted iron chair near the shaded end of the lawn, stirred her tea slowly and watched the proceedings with her usual delicate air of mild detachment. She was not fond of croquet. She was, however, deeply fond of people's expressions when they believed no one was truly observing them. Among the guests was Colonel Archibald Harrington, Reated, whose conversation was as loud as his opinions. Miss Pamela Gray, a former governess turned aspiring poetess, always poised with a notebook. Young Richard Fanshawe, Mildred's stepson from the late Mr. Fanshawe's first marriage, back from London with restless energy and suspicious tan lines, and Mrs. Isabel Makepeace, a thin-lipped woman from the next parish who had recently become a vigorous campaigner against urban corruption in the countryside. One couldn't help but notice she was also recently widowed, though, unlike Mildred, she made a point of still wearing black dot at precisely 4 o'clock. Mildred herself rose to clink her silver spoon against a glass. "A small announcement, my dears," she trilled, flushed with the combined effects of port, sunshine, and the thrill of vague importance. "In 2 days' time, I shall be hosting a special dinner, just 12 of us, by invitation only. You'll know if you're on the list," she added with a smirk that didn't quite meet her eyes. An awkward flutter passed through the garden. 12. There were nearly 20 guests in attendance. Miss Marple took a quiet sip from her teacup. She was rather certain she would not be receiving an invitation, not because Mildred disliked her, but because she was, as always, overlooked. And yet, Jane had already seen enough small glances, stiffened jaws, and forced smiles to know that this simple announcement had unsettled several people. The Colonel grunted. "Bit of a lottery then, eh? Sounds like a dinner party from a detective novel." Pamela Gray, who was scribbling in her notebook, looked up suddenly. "But I thought you were doing a series of 3 dinners, Mildred. Didn't you say something to me about a trilogy of guests?" Mildred blinked. "Did I? Oh no, that must have been something else. Just this one. It's quite final, in fact." Miss Marple raised a single eyebrow. She could recall, in fact, the butcher's boy had mentioned a series of unusual grocery orders from the Laurels over the past 3 weeks' quantities that suggested not 1, but 3 formal dinners. Later that evening, as the guests began to take their leave, some with strained smiles, others still glancing around to see who might be on the chosen list, Miss Marple lingered just a moment longer near the veranda, tending to adjust her shawl. She was just in time to overhear Richard Fanshawe's sharp whisper to Mildred, "You can't be serious. After everything, him?" Mildred's response was quiet, but her tone cut through the twilight like a snapped stem. "Don't presume to tell me who belongs here, Richard. I make my own decisions. I always have." Miss Marple walked quietly on, as though she hadn't heard a thing. She looked up once at the house. A 3rd dinner had been planned. That much she was sure of. But now Mildred claimed otherwise. Why? 2 days later, there would be another gathering at the Laurels, but only 11 guests would arrive. 12th invitation had gone out, but its recipient would never be seen again. And so, the mystery of the third invitation had begun. Chapter 2. Whispers in the post office. The Morning Post in Aldala was never especially exciting, but it was sacred. Each villager had their own particular routine, and for Miss Marple, the ritual of visiting the post office after breakfast was both an errand and an opportunity to observe the subtle ripples that ran through village life. This morning, the post office was humming not with activity, but with anticipation. Miss Hartnell, the postmistress, was sorting through the remaining letters behind the glass partition with a frown deeper than usual. At her counter stood Mrs. Weatherby, who often styled herself the unofficial chronicler of village life. She leaned forward in such a conspiratorial pose that Miss Marple paused politely by the biscuit rack to listen without appearing to do so. They were hand-delivered, Mrs. Weatherby whispered, not even posted. Slipped under doors last night, so I hear. Who? Asked Miss Hartnell without looking up. The invitations, Mrs. Weatherby said, lowering her voice still further. To Mrs. Fanshaw's dinner. My neighbor Maudie received one gold embossed card, cream envelope, her name written in an old-fashioned calligraphy. Very grand. Miss Hartnell snorted. All that fuss for cold pheasant and half-witted conversation. I didn't get one, said Mrs. Weatherby, with just the faintest trace of sourness. Nor did Mr. Gilly or Reverend Pilbeam, and he's known Mildred for 30 years. Miss Marple stepped up as Mrs. Weatherby drifted off, still muttering. The old lady smiled gently at Miss Hartnell. No letters today, Miss Marple, the postmistress said, then hesitated. You didn't come in. You weren't invited, were you? Goodness no, Miss Marple replied with a light chuckle. I dare say Mrs. Fanshawe thought I might find her gathering a bit too lively, and perhaps she's quite right. Besides, one dinner is much like another, wouldn't you say? But in truth, Jane Marple was rather curious. 12 invitations, hand-delivered in secret. And already, people were dissecting not who had been included, but who had been excluded. That told her something very particular about the kind of event Mrs. Fanshawe intended to host. That afternoon, Miss Marple stopped by the greengrocer's for apples and learned entirely by accident, of course, that Colonel Harrington had been seen driving toward Barton Lane early that morning, rather red in the face. Pamela Gray, the poetess, had received her invitation as well, and told everyone who would listen that she had half a mind to attend, and half a mind to decline. One can never be too available to society. And young Richard Fanshawe, according to Miss Perkins, who had passed him near the mill pond, he'd been pacing back and forth and smoking heavily, muttering something about madness and what she thinks she's doing. When Miss Marple returned home that evening to her neat little cottage with its laced antimacassars and thriving sweet peas, she sat with her knitting untouched in her lap. There was something odd, something discordant. The idea of a formal dinner was not strange in itself, but why the secrecy? Why exclude so many of her usual companions? And, most curiously of all, why did Mrs. Fanshawe deny what she had already implied to others, that this was not the first such gathering? By late evening, word reached her from young Kitty Sims, who delivered milk on Tuesdays and always had more to say than her route required. Kitty, pink-faced and breathless, knocked on Miss Marple's door just before twilight. I saw something, miss, she said, nervously, twisting her cap. I wasn't snooping, honest, but I was near the back road by the laurels this morning, and I saw Mr. Richard T. had one of them envelopes in his hand, like they said, but he tore it up, right in the hedge. Didn't even look at it twice. Just crushed it and walked off, angry like. Miss Marple's brow furrowed. Are you quite sure it was an invitation? Well, I only saw the edge, said Kitty, but it was that thick, shiny sort of paper. Same sort Maudie Sykes showed off down at the Women's Institute. Miss Marple thanked the girl and gave her a warm currant bun for her troubles. She watched as Kitty disappeared down the road, then closed the door, and went to her writing desk. She took out her notebook, an old thing with marbled edges and a worn ribbon, and wrote a single sentence: the torn invitation, refusal, or fear. The next day brought no great revelations, but the atmosphere in Aldala had shifted subtly. At the baker's, people whispered over their loaves. At the church, glances were exchanged instead of greetings. It was as though the dinner scheduled for that very evening had thrown the entire village into a suspended state of waiting. At precisely 7 o'clock, Marple sat by her lace-curtained window with her lamp on low, watching the road that led toward the Laurels. The guests passed by by one. The colonel in his sputtering rover, Pamela on her bicycle with a scarf tied impractically high, and Isabel, Makepeace, riding with a man Miss Marple did not recognize, and others less distinct in the fading light. 11. In total, by her count, 11 guests entered the Laurels by morning. The 12th would still be missing, and one of the 11 would never quite explain the truth of what they saw that night. Chapter 3. The 12th guest who never arrived by the following morning. Aldala was gripped by something it had not felt in years. Uncertainty, not fear. Exactly, no one had said the word murder yet. Not aloud, but a tightness had settled over the village like a mist over the common. There were murmurs, half-formed thoughts exchanged behind closed curtains, and a collective knowledge that something had gone wrong. At 7:30, Constable Barnes bicycled up to the Laurels. He did not expect trouble after all. It was just a dinner party. By 9 o'clock, Inspector Crayford himself had arrived from the county station in Lower Marchwood, looking uncharacteristically alert for so early in the day. By 10, a woman from the next village was crying on her front step, and by midday, everyone in Aldala knew that one of the dinner guests had never come home. Miss Marple heard it first from the postmistress. "They say it's the solicitor," Miss Hartnell whispered, cupping her hand near her mouth as though the word itself might bring ill luck. "Mr. Lionel Humble, the one who took over old Mr. Bartlett's practice, quiet fella, lived alone near the green. Never caused any fuss." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Mr. Humble? Oh yes, gentle manners, always courteous. Rather particular about punctuality, as I recall." "That's just it," Miss Hartnell said. "He never returned home after the dinner. House locked from the outside. No note, no sign of anything disturbed, but the housekeeper swears he never came in. Still made up the guest bed, too." Miss Marple returned to her cottage with her basket only half full. In truth, she had very little need of supplies that morning. She had intended only to watch the village closely, to listen for the subtle distortions in speech that came when people tried to explain things they didn't quite understand. Richard Fanshawe hadn't been seen since late the previous evening, though his car was back in the drive. Pamela Gray had been overheard saying that the party had ended abruptly, and that Mrs. Fanshawe had seemed quite distracted in a shimmering way. For Mildred herself, no one had yet dared call on her, though. The curtains at the Laurels had remained tightly drawn since dawn. At 11 o'clock, Inspector Crayford visited Miss Marple. He was a tall, square-faced man with sleeves that always seemed one fold too short, and the slight air of a man who had once failed to make sergeant in the army. But he was not unkind, and he had learned more quickly than some of his predecessors that Miss Marple's mind worked like a lockpick through soft wood. "Miss Marple," he said as he sat in her parlor with obvious discomfort, "I'm sure you've heard what's happened." "I have heard that Mr. Humble failed to return home." After dinner, she replied gently, pouring tea, and that Mrs. Fanshawe's gathering was selective. Crayford gave a non-committal grunt. 11 guests, all accounted for. "Everyone says Mr. Humble never arrived, but Mrs. Fanshawe swears he did." Skezzy sat between Pamela Gray and that fellow from the parish committee. "What's his name? Mr. Stokes." "Mr. Julian Stokes. Yes, treasurer, and extremely punctual." "That's him." Pamela confirms Mr. Humble was seated. Stokes does too. But now it gets strange. Neither of them recalls speaking to him during dinner. Miss Marple lifted her teacup, tilting her head. Not a word, she asked. Apparently not. Said he was quiet, ate his soup, drank his wine, but neither of them can remember him leaving the table. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And Mrs. Fanshawe, how did she behave during the evening? Okay, by most accounts, distracted, nervous, even. Her housemaid says she stayed up most of the night. Said she heard her pacing after the guests had gone. Miss Marple leaned back ever so slightly. Did she serve fish? She asked suddenly. Crayford blinked. I don't know. You might inquire. I believe she had fish delivered the morning of the dinner. Quite a bit of it, from Mr. Molesbury Haddock, I think. Crayford frowned, noting it in his pad. Right. And what are you thinking, Miss Marple? I am merely listening. She said. People reveal much when they believe they are explaining nothing. The inspector stood reluctantly. I suppose you'll want to poke around yourself then. Oh no, she replied mildly. The village will come to me, Inspector. It always does. And so it did. By the end of the day, 3 visitors had passed through her gate. Pamela Gray came first, under the pretense of delivering a poem she'd drafted in memory of mystery and melancholy. Her real purpose, however, was clear from the way she glanced toward Miss Marple's mantelpiece and asked, as if offhand, whether she had ever seen a man fade into silence at a table like mist. Miss Marple simply replied, sometimes. People are louder in their absence than in their presence. Next came young Kitty Sims, again, this time reporting that she'd seen Richard Fanshawe walking into the woods near dusk the previous night alone, coatless, and carrying something small and pale tucked under his arm. And last came Reverend Pilbeam, who, under the guise of delivering an invitation to a church raffle, confided in Miss Marple that Mrs. Fanshawe had come to confession the previous week for the first time in 2 years. She didn't say much, he muttered, but she said, okay, she had sinned through omission, not commission. Does that mean anything to you? Miss Marple smiled politely, but her mind was already threading these fragments together. A missing man who had reportedly been present, forgotten in the act of remembering, a son who seemed furious with his stepmother, a secret confession, a torn invitation. She sat at her writing desk again that evening, beneath the gentle ticking of the mantel clock, hand added to her notebook. Lionel Humble was there, but someone needed him to vanish unnoticed. Outside, the village lights dimmed one by one as Aldrila slid quietly into an uneasy sleep. But in Miss Marple's mind, the pieces of a dark puzzle were beginning to find their shape. Chapter 4. The Man Who Ate in Silence. 2 days after the ill-fated dinner at the Laurels, the guests who had attended began returning to their ordinary routines, at least outwardly. But Miss Marple, seated behind her garden wall with a straw hat and a trowel she barely used, watched closely as each of them passed by her gate. She had seen Julian Stokes that morning, pausing for an unusually long time outside the greengrocer's, speaking in a low voice with Pamela Gray. Their conversation was serious to serious for a discussion about fruit. Pamela held her notebook against her chest as if shielding it, while Stokes gestured with tightly curled fingers, betraying more nerves than calm. The village paper had not yet published anything official about Mr. Lionel Humble's disappearance. The police were still calling it a matter of concern, not yet a crime, but the absence was undeniable now. His office remained closed, his house silent. The milk left at his doorstep 2 mornings in a row had gone sour. And still no sign of the man who, by all accounts, had quietly attended a dinner and then, quietly, ceased to exist. Miss Marple had spoken again to Inspector Crayford the previous evening, and he had reluctantly shared one more piece of curious information. The guest list matched the place settings, he said. 12 cards on the table, all addressed, all accounted for, except there's a discrepancy. Oh, Miss Marple prompted, eyebrows rising. Mrs. Fancho said she wrote the place cards herself, but when we collected them, 2 had been rewritten, different handwriting. Miss Marple paused. Swans, Richard Fanshawe and Lionel Humble. Now, on this pale morning in Audiline, she waited not for gossip, but for the next inconsistency to surface. And it came, not in the form of a visitor, but through something far more ordinary, a misplaced library book at noon. Miss Marple visited the modest little reading room on the corner of Church Lane. The librarian, Miss Trudy Hemmings, had been in charge of the collection since 1932 and could remember not only who borrowed which books, but when and why. Miss Marple's excuse was a desire to revisit the law and the lady, but it was the record logs she truly wished to see. "Oh dear," said Trudy, frowning at the wooden borrowing drawer. "There's a mistake here." "What sort of mistake?" "Well, Mr. Humble checked out a volume on Victorian wills and inheritance laws last Wednesday, but it's not been returned." "Odd," Miss Marple murmured. "Mr. Humble was always quite timely with returns." Trudy hesitated. "That's just it. He returned it." Miss Marple looked up. "I remember it clearly because it was after closing. He knocked at the side door and handed it to himself. Said he had no time to linger. But the record shows it's still out, so one must have removed the entry." Miss Marple gently placed her hand over the librarian's. "Trudy, my dear, do you happen to recall what the man was wearing?" "Wearing?" Trudy blinked. "Why, a light gray suit. The same one he wore at the council meeting last month, and a white carnation on his lapel." "A white carnation," Miss Marple repeated. "Yes, rather odd, really. I thought perhaps he was going to a wedding." Miss Marple did not reply, but in her notebook that night she would write, "Mr. Humble returned a book after he was reported missing. White carnation equals formal attire. Possible impersonation." That afternoon brought more whispers. Pamela Gray came again to call, this time carrying a letter she claimed to have received in the Morning Post. It was unsigned, typed, and brief. "You should forget what you saw. Nothing happened. Lionel Humble left of his own accord." Miss Marple read it carefully. The tone was mechanical, overly controlled, and the typeface, not from a typewriter, but from a modern, ribbon-fed portable, the kind Richard Fancho had once used at university. "You're frightened, dear," Miss Marple said gently. Pamela didn't deny it. "Yes, because I know he was there. I remember. Something now. Something strange." "What is it?" Pamela swallowed. "At one point, during the main course, I looked up and noticed Mr. Humble staring at Mildred, not smiling, not hostile either, just fixed, as though he was waiting for her to say something." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And did she?" "No, she never looked at him, not once." Miss Marple thanked her and saw her out with a slice of walnut cake wrapped in paper. Then she sat, knitting untouched again, and began tracing the arc of this mystery, not just the disappearance, but the quiet tension that hung around every person involved. She thought of Richard tearing up the invitation. She thought of Mildred, who would confess to a sin of omission. And she thought of Lionel Humble present, silent, staring, who may have come to that dinner not as a guest, but as a threat. That evening, as a storm gathered over the horizon and the wind teased at the roses on her trellis, Miss Marple opened her notebook once more and added, "Dinner party theater. Someone wanted Mr. Humble to be seen, but not remembered. Why?" The rain began gently, and in a drawing room not far from hers, a woman stood alone, staring into the fire, clutching a torn piece of parchment. Her hands trembled, for tomorrow the inquest would begin, and it would no longer be possible to pretend that Lionel Humble had merely vanished. Someone knew what had happened, and someone had already started to lie. Chapter 5. The omission at the inquest. The day of the inquest dawned gray and still. The sky above Aldala, pressed down by a quilt of low-hanging clouds. The village hall, usually reserved for floral exhibitions and temperance lectures, had been cleared of bunting and chairs to host the coroner and a small, tense audience. Miss Marple arrived 5 minutes before it began, wrapped in a dove-gray shawl and carrying a worn notebook tucked beneath her arm. She did not intend to speak, merely to listen. But often, in Miss Marple's experience, listening was the louder act. Inside, the atmosphere was one of discomfort, thinly disguised as solemnity. The coroner, Mr. Tobias Rindle, a man of dour beard and practical shoes, sat at the head of a makeshift dais. Clerk shuffled papers beside him. The dozen or so villagers presented those who had attended the dinner or knew Mr. Humble, even passingly, were seated in rows, their faces drawn and eyes restless. Mrs. Fanshawe arrived, flanked by her solicitor, a rigid man with a clipped mustache. She wore a demure navy dress and no jewelry, save for a string of pearls, and though she held her chin high, the color had drained from her cheeks. She did not glance toward the crowd. Richard Fanshawe entered shortly afterward, alone, his tie uneven and his collar too tight. He kept to the back row and tapped one foot in relentless rhythm. The inquest began with formalities, the confirmation of identity, the reading of Mr. Humble's last known movements, the testimony of his housekeeper, who had discovered the unopened post and untouched bed. Then came the more curious portion, the accounts from those present at the Laurels on the night in question. Pamela Gray was called first. "I did see him there," she insisted, her voice brittle. "He was seated beside me. He didn't speak, but he ate. He drank wine. He looked terribly tired." "Kay, and you saw him leave?" the coroner asked. Pamela hesitated. "No, I didn't. I don't know when he left. I assumed he had gone before dessert. But I never saw him rise from the table." There was a murmur at this, quickly hushed. Julian Stokes gave much the same account. Mr. Humble was there. He remembered the white carnation, the slow, methodical way he chewed. But no one could say when the man had left. No sound of a door, no coat retrieved, no farewell. Mrs. Fanshawe was called last. Her testimony was met with palpable unease. "Yes, he was present," she said, her voice composed but quiet. "He accepted the invitation, handed it to him. Myself, 3 days prior. He attended, and we dined. I spoke to him early in the evening, during drinks. He complimented the decor." "Did he leave the premises during the evening?" "I believe so," she replied, then glanced briefly toward the audience. "I assumed he had slipped out quietly." Lionel was not a man who enjoyed long conversation or crowded rooms. "Did you see him go?" "No," she admitted. "Did not?" The coroner's pen paused. "Mrs. Fanshawe, is it possible Mr. Humble never left at all?" The room stilled. Her voice faltered for the first time. "I don't see how that could be. I would have known." Inspector Crayford stood to interject. "We searched the Laurels thoroughly, sir. There is no indication that Mr. Humble remained on the property. No sign of struggle, no trace in the guest rooms or grounds. And yet," the coroner said evenly, 11 people say he was there, and not one saw him leave. No one has seen him since. A curious vanishing act, wouldn't you say?" Miss Marple scribbled lightly in her notebook, "If 11 see," yet none noticed the exit was the 12th guest meant to vanish. After the formal statements, the room began to clear. But Miss Marple remained in her seat, watching one face. In particular, Richard Fanshawe. His jaw was clenched, and when he thought no one was looking, he massaged his temples like a man under pressure. Outside the hall, a few drops of rain began to fall. Pamela Gray was speaking softly with the Reverend Pilbeam beneath the eaves. Julian Stokes left in a rush, ignoring greetings. Miss Marple, however, lingered just outside the door until she caught sight of Inspector Crayford emerging. "Inspector," she said pleasantly. Might I suggest something rather peculiar? He gave her the look of a man both intrigued and wary. Always, he said. Have you checked the dining room carpet? Crayford blinked. Pardon? The carpet, Inspector. A fine Persian one, if memory serves. Cream with a delicate red vine pattern. If someone had spilled wine, say, clumsily or unexpectedly, might have left a stain. And if that stain were cleaned, there might still be a mark, a shadow. I dare say Mrs. Fanshawe might have insisted it was just old tea. But Lionel Humble was seated beside Pamela and Mr. Stokes. Neither of them saw him leave. But what if he didn't? Crayford looked at her sharply. Are you suggesting he collapsed during dinner? No, Miss Marple said quietly. I'm suggesting he may have never been alive during dinner at all. The inspector paled. That would mean that the dinner was a charade, a performance, meant to establish that Lionel Humble was present, seen, and well. But suppose he wasn't. Suppose he was already dead before the guests even arrived. Crayford stood frozen. Miss Marple patted his arm. I do think it would be worth examining the flower arrangements as well, particularly the one in the center of the table. Lavender, if I recall, quite tall, with dense foliage. Exactly the sort of thing to obscure a still figure, if one sat very, very still indeed. And with that, she turned and walked away, her pace as slow and composed as ever. Behind her, a storm finally broke over Alderlawn. Thunder rolled through the clouds. But the real storm was yet to come, because the question was no longer where. Lionel Humble had gone. It was when had he did and who had pretended he hadn't. Chapter 6. The lavender screen. That same afternoon, while the village still buzzed with half-digested speculation about the inquest, Inspector Crayford paid an unannounced visit to the Laurels. Constable stood discreetly at the front gate, but Crayford entered alone, his boots heavy on the rain-dampened gravel path. Mrs. Mildred Fanshawe greeted him at the door with a practiced calm that struck Crayford as far too deliberate. I suppose you've come to rifle through the flower arrangements, Inspector, she said, with a brittle smile. Miss Marple has been busy, hasn't she? Crayford didn't smile back. I've come to ask some questions. Okay, yes, I'd like to see the dining room exactly as it was set for the dinner, if you haven't changed it. As it happens, Mildred said, turning on her heel, I haven't. Dining room was large and sparsely adorned, save for the wide cherry-wood table at its center, still partially set with silver cutlery and delicate dessert plates. The place cards had been collected, but the centerpiece remained intact, a tall, unruly bouquet of lavender, baby's breath, and thistles rising from an ornate silver urn. It was fragrant, showy, and, as Miss Marple had noted, unusually dense. Crayford circled the table slowly. The chairs had been returned to neutral positions, though some still bore faint impressions in the cushions. Okay? He crouched, ran a hand under the table's edge, and paused near the spot where Lionel Humble had supposedly sat. I'll need the carpet up, he said quietly. Mrs. Fanshawe, now leaning in the doorway with her arms crossed, paled but said nothing. Crayford rose and tapped the corner of the rug with his toe. It lifted with surprising ease, no tacks. No weighty furniture anchoring it. Beneath the ornate vines and cream silk, faint but unmistakable, was a circular mark. Not a red wine stain, but something more sinister. A dark bloom, almost rust-colored, faded now, but not erased. Something spilled, Crayford asked without looking up. I knocked over a cordial glass, Mildred replied, too quickly. I was nervous that evening. It's hardly a crime, Inspector. No, he said evenly. But murder is. She drew herself up at that, her lips tight. Are you accusing me? I'm asking whether Lionel Humble arrived at this house alive. There was a long pause. Then Mildred, with trembling hands, sat down in the nearest chair and said softly, he threatened to expose something about my husband's estate. He claimed Lionel had discovered discrepancies. Crayford remained silent, waiting. He said Edwin, my late husband, had changed his will, left everything to Richard. Quietly, without telling me that I had no legal claim to the laurels. So you invited him here, huh? I invited him to explain himself, to ask for proof. But he arrived furious, said he would go public, said I had manipulated Edwin in his final days. She stopped, swallowing hard. I didn't kill him, Inspector, but I did panic, and he collapsed. He had a heart condition. He shouted, then gasped, and before I could even fetch water, he was gone. Did you call a doctor? You know, I don't know why. It was the shock. Then Richard arrived unexpectedly. I told him what had happened, and we made a terrible decision. Crayford raised an eyebrow. You pretended he was still alive. We dressed him, sat him at the table, surrounded him with that ridiculous bouquet, told the others he was tired, was distracted. No one spoke to him, no one touched him. And after the last guest left, Richard helped me move him to the wood behind the house. He thought it would look like Lionel had left of his own accord. Crayford let the silence stretch, and the rewritten place card had written his name in ink. But Richard, he said it would look suspicious if they analyzed the handwriting, so he rewrote it himself. He thought of everything. Crayford exhaled through his nose. Where's Richard now? But Mildred only shook her head. He left this morning, said he needed to think. As the inspector departed and the front door closed behind him, Mildred remained in the dining room, alone. The lavender no longer smelled like calm. It smelled like rot. That evening, news of the confession reached Miss Marple via Inspector Crayford's quick call at her gate. She nodded quietly, as though this, too, had been expected, but she did not close her notebook just yet, because something still itched at the edge of her thoughts. If Lionel Humble had been already dead when the guests arrived, if the dinner had been a farce to create an alibi, then why had someone sent Pamela Gray an anonymous letter afterward, warning her to keep quiet? Why reinforce a lie lest someone else had something far more to lose? She turned back several pages and reread her earlier notes. Dinner equals performance, but for whose benefit? She reached for a pen, tapped it gently against the table, and beneath that question, she wrote, Richard Fanshawe may have helped stage a body. But what if he wasn't the one who needed Lionel dead? Outside, a carriage rattled past. A dog barked once, then fell silent, and in the distance, under the first stars of the evening, a man stood on a hilltop, staring down at Aldala, the dinner invitation in his pocket, already torn in two. Chapter 7. The signature that shouldn't exist by the next morning. A subdued hush had fallen over Aldala, one that seemed to cling to hedgerows and drift through the lanes like the smoke from early fires. It wasn't merely the weight of scandal that silenced the village, but something deeper, since that truth had emerged too early, too easily. Miss Marple, for one, remained unconvinced that the case had truly settled. Inspector Crayford had done his duty. He had taken Mrs. Fanshaw's statement, alerted his superiors, and sent 2 constables to collect Richard Fanshawe if he turned up again. It's the official narrative, now filtering out through murmured conversations and sidelong glances, was one of misjudgment and panic. A man collapsed. Again, 2 frightened relatives staged a grotesque tableau to avoid disgrace. Not quite a murder, but not innocent either. Yet something within Miss Marple resisted closure. The story didn't fit, not the entire shape of it. It held too tightly to performance, too neatly to coincidence. And then, as if to confirm her suspicion, the postmistress came calling. It was just after 11, and Miss Marple had settled into her parlor with embroidery and a modest bowl of pears, when Miss Hartnell knocked. I shouldn't be the one to bring this, Jane, she said breathlessly, but I've just come from Mr. Abels, the solicitor's clerk in Lower Marchwood. He asked me to deliver this, he said. Well, you'd know what to do with it. She handed Miss Marple a brown envelope. Inside was a single documented official copy of a will, marked with the seal of Lionel Humble's firm. Miss Marple read, slowly, methodically. It was a revision, clearly stamped and witnessed just 3 weeks prior. A new will, dated and signed by Lionel Humble. And in this version, Mildred Fanshawe was the sole beneficiary of her late husband's estate, not Richard. Miss Marple read it again, then folded the paper and set it on the table beside her untouched pears. This changed everything. By mid-afternoon, she was walking the gravel path to the Laurels, knitting bag over one arm, her feet moving more briskly than usual. She found Mrs. Fanshawe in the conservatory, seated among wilting orchids and unopened correspondence. Her face was drawn, and her fingers fidgeted with a handkerchief already twisted tight from use. "I hope you don't mind me calling, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. "I thought you might welcome a friend, and perhaps a second pair of eyes." Mildred looked up warily. "Everyone seems to know everything already." "I find," Miss Marple said as she sat, "that it's often what people think they know that causes the most damage. I wanted to ask you a small question about your husband's will." Mildred blinked. "What of it?" "You said Lionel claimed there had been a change, that he had documents. But he never showed you a copy, did he?" "No, he only threatened." Miss Marple reached into her bag and removed the envelope. "Then you'll be surprised to know that 3 weeks ago, he filed a new will, one naming you as sole heir." Mildred's hands froze. "No, that can't be," Richard said. "Richard said the will had been changed, but he told you it favored him. What if he lied?" Mildred stared at the paper, pale beneath her powder. "But why would he?" Miss Marple spoke gently. "'Cause he never intended for Lionel Humble to reveal this will, 'cause it didn't serve his purpose." Mildred covered her mouth. "I'm beginning to believe," Miss Marple continued, "that Lionel Humble didn't die of natural causes, that Richard saw him as a threat just to your reputation, but to his inheritance, and that you were manipulated into helping conceal a death that wasn't accidental at all." Mildred shook her head. "But he looked so pale." He clutched his chest. Miss Marple nodded kindly. "And Richard told you he had a history of heart trouble?" "Yes, that you shouldn't blame yourself." Mildred's breath caught. "Poison," Miss Marple said softly. "There are subtle ones. Tasteless, odorless." Lionel Humble drank wine that evening, didn't he? Was the glass already poured when he arrived? Mildred's voice cracked. "Cass, Richard handed it to him before I'd even come downstairs." Miss Marple sat back in her chair. "And that, my dear, is why no one saw him leave. He never did. Because by the time you all sat to dine, he was no longer truly alive." That evening, Miss Marple visited Inspector Crayford with the will and the testimony. He listened in stony silence, growing more rigid with every word. "You believe the son poisoned the solicitor," he said at last, "and let his mother believe she was at fault. She adored her husband's memory." Miss Marple replied. "She feared scandal, yes, but more than that. She feared losing what little place she had in the world. Richard knew that. He played her guilt like a violin, and the fake dinner, designed to cement the illusion that Lionel was alive and well at the Laurels. Everyone saw him, so no one would question his disappearance. But the centerpiece, those tall lavender stalks, helped conceal his condition. He was propped, positioned, carefully orchestrated, and the letter Pamela Gray received. Miss Marple's voice dropped. "Richard," again, making sure no one grew suspicious too soon, but he miscalculated. Pamela remembered the carnation. I remembered the butcher's tally. And now we have the will. Crayford stood. "I'll have him brought in by morning." "Be careful," Miss Marple warned. "He's cleverer than he seems, and more desperate now than ever." That night, the wind shifted direction. blowing hard over Alderley's thatched roofs and trembling fences at a small railway station 2 counties away. A man purchased a one-way ticket under a false name, a folded invitation still in his coat pocket, and in her neat little cottage. Miss Marple added one final note for the day. Truth lies not in the invitation sent, but in the motive it conceals. Chapter 8. The Teacup in the Study. The next morning dawned brittle and sharp, with a brittle sun and a wind that rattled every pane of Alderley's cottages. Miss Marple, rising early as always, boiled her water precisely and poured it over loose Darjeeling leaves, her eyes fixed not on the pot, but on the memory of Richard Fanshaw's face, tight with fury at the dinner, withdrawn at the inquest, and, most damning of all, absent now. Inspector Crayford had not located him overnight. The constables posted at the station in the East Road had seen no one matching his description. And at the Laurels, his room had been left in the peculiar state drawers untouched, but the desk suspiciously bare. Only one object remained, according to Crayford, a teacup, clean on the outside, but with a ring of undissolved white powder lining its base, by 9 o'clock. The inspector was knocking on Miss Marple's gate again. "Come in," she said, ushering him toward the sitting room, where the fire was already lit and the tea tray set. "I suppose you haven't found him." Crayford looked grim. "Gone like mist. Nothing but footprints to the lane. No one at the station recalls selling him a ticket, but I'd wager he's halfway to the coast by now. Or farther, Miss," Marple said softly, "especially if he'd planned this all along." Crayford rubbed a hand over his chin. "We tested the residue in the teacup. Not sugar, not milk. Something closer to Digitalis foxglove extract. Subtle in wine. Deadly in large enough measure. So Lionel didn't die from excitement or natural frailty," Miss Marple murmured. "It was orchestrated, as I suspected. But there's something else troubling me." Crayford raised a brow. "You usually have 3 things troubling you." Miss Marple, she allowed herself a modest smile. "Quite right. But this particular worry concerns motive. We've all assumed Richard acted out of greed, the inheritance, the estate. But now that we've seen the revised will want that benefits Mildred, not Richard, I find myself asking why he was so certain Lionel must be silenced." Crayford frowned. If Lionel had already filed the new will, what could Richard have been afraid of? Miss Marple poured tea, stirring slowly. Suppose there had been another will. One drafted after the first change, but not yet submitted. One that would restore the estate to Richard. Something Lionel hadn't yet delivered, but had with him that night. Crayford blinked, and if that version vanished, Miss Marple nodded. It would explain why Lionel had to be present, but voiceless. If he'd shown that second revision to Mildred, or to anyone else, Richard's scheme would have been exposed. And that would have been motive, not just for deception, but for murder. The inspector stood and began pacing. "We need his luggage, his office, everything. If there's another version of that will, it might still exist." Marple gently cleared her throat. "Before you rush off, Inspector, I may have a suggestion." Crayford stopped mid-step. "There's a safe in Lionel Humble's office," she continued, very plain. "Behind the curtain, near the writing desk. A's housekeeper told me once, without realizing its significance, that he kept fresh biscuits. Inside, she found that most peculiar." Crayford gave a bark of laughter. "You're telling me a solicitor used his safe to store biscuits?" "Only some of the time, I imagine," said Miss Marple. "But it means he used it regularly. And if he carried something sensitive, like a will he hadn't yet finalized, he might have placed a copy there out of habit, before delivering the original to Mrs. Fanshawe." Within an hour, Inspector Crayford had sent a man to Lionel's office with a locksmith. Miss Marple remained behind, knitting calmly and watching the road beyond her hedge. Shortly before noon, a boy came running up the path, out of breath and waving a scrap of paper. "From the inspector, miss." She unfolded the note, found it, handwritten, dated the morning of the dinner. Full revision, favoring Richard Fanshawe. Its witness lines blank. Would not yet be legal, but motive confirmed. Miss Marple folded the note and set it beside her tea. It was then the missing piece. Richard had known of both wills, perhaps even convinced Lionel to draft the latter, hoping to secure his place. But when Lionel hesitated to sign it, or worse, changed his mind, Richard had decided to act before the solicitor could share the truth, and thus the dinner. A masquerade to prove Lionel had been alive and functional, right up until the moment he disappeared. As Marple reflected on the elegance of the deception. It was all there, a formal dinner, a missing guest, a carefully crafted illusion of normalcy. And yet, it had been too careful, too deliberate. The lie had whispered through its perfection, and there was one final whisper yet to come. At sunset, a stranger arrived in Aldala. He was tall, neatly dressed, with a worn briefcase, and the manner of someone who walked with purpose, but looked over his shoulder too often. He knocked at Miss Marple's door. "Miss Marple?" "Yes, I'm Oliver Creed. I was Lionel Humble's assistant, up in Marchwood. I've been away on family matters. Heard what happened, and I found something I think you ought to see." She ushered him in, noting his nervous hands and the faint bruising near his collar. "I went by the office this morning," he continued, "and I found this." It was taped under Lionel's desk. He produced a small envelope, plain, sealed, but bearing the faint outline of Lionel's monogram in the wax dot. Miss Marple opened it slowly. Inside was a single slip of notepaper in Lionel's careful handwriting. "If anything happens to me, look to the guest who drinks nothing and speaks only when spoken to. R.F." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. He knew. He just didn't act in time. Oliver Creed stared. "Who is R.F.?" She stood gently, the firelight catching her expression. "A man who will no longer find Aldala quite as welcoming as he thought." She added the letter to her notebook, folded everything into its place, and whispered to herself. The third invitation was never meant to summon a guest, but to reveal a killer. Chapter 9. The trap set over TB. The next day, Inspector Crayford had issued a formal warrant for Richard Fanshawe's arrest. Copy of Lionel Humble's final, unsigned will had been sent to the county solicitor's office, and Oliver Creed's letter, the last whisper of the dead man's suspicions, was already in evidence. And yet, Richard remained elusive. Trains and coastal roads were being watched, and yet no sightings had emerged. Crayford was furious, pacing his office with scuffed boots and muttered threats about slippery airs. But Miss Marple, seated quietly across from him with her knitting bag, seemed almost calm. "You're telling me," Crayford said through gritted teeth, "that he's still here? Somewhere in Aldala?" "I believe so, yes," Miss Marple replied, adjusting her spectacles. "You see, people who flee in a panic make mistakes. The people who plan their escape tend to overcalculate. Richard knows that if he vanishes completely, the assumption will be guilt. But if he simply waits, perhaps pretending to be elsewhere until things cool, then he can re-enter the scene with some plausible explanation: illness, perhaps, or distress. He wants to shape the story from within." Crayford blinked. "He's hiding in plain sight." "Not so plain, but I do believe he has help." "His mother?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Mildred is broken, not complicit. But there are other hands willing to steady a fallen heir, those with debts of gratitude or secrets of their own." Crayford's brow furrowed. "You have someone in mind." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice low. "Julianne Stokes." Crayford startled. "The parish treasurer?" "Precisely. Stokes once handled a modest trust belonging to the Fanshawe estate. There were rumors, quiet ones, that some accounting ledgers had gone missing several years ago. Nothing proven, of course, but Lionel Humble knew. He mentioned it to Oliver Creed once in passing. Crayford stood, eyes narrowing. Then you think Stokes is harboring Richard? I believe it's possible. Speculation won't draw him out. She smiled faintly. However, an invitation might. That afternoon, Miss Marple composed a series of polite, handwritten notes, each on her own cream stationery with a delicate blue border. The message was simple. Tea at 4 in the garden room. A few thoughts to share on the matter that has unsettled us all. No publicity, just clarity. Yours, Jane Marple. She sent one to Pamela Gray, one to Reverend Pilbeam, one to Julian Stokes, and one, addressed carefully and with no return name, to the Chase, a quiet cottage just past the village boundary that had been vacant until 2 nights ago. Its current occupant, according to Kitty Sims, the milk girl, had paid in cash and given only a Christian name, Richard. The letters were delivered discreetly. Miss Marple made sure of that. At precisely 4 o'clock, the guests began to arrive. Pamela was first, wearing her usual long scarf and a nervous energy that made her tremble when she reached for her teacup. Next came Reverend Pilbeam, red-faced and out of breath, as if he had jogged part of the way. He offered a few hesitant condolences and spoke very little. Then came Julian Stokes. He appeared relaxed, too relaxed. Miss Marple, from decades of tea parties, knew the difference between a man who enjoyed cucumber sandwiches and one who ate them so that his hands would be busy. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Stokes," she said pleasantly. "I've invited just a few trusted minds to help me understand something. You were, after all, seated beside Lionel Humble the night he vanished. You may recall his manner." Stokes wiped his mouth with his napkin. "Quiet. That's what we all agreed. Nothing unusual, quite." And yet Lionel Humble, in his final letter, seemed to believe someone would remember more than silence. Someone who said nothing and drank nothing. Stokes's hand paused in mid-air. Pamela looked up. "I remember now. That's true. He didn't touch his wine. I thought perhaps he was feeling unwell." Marple smiled kindly. "Not Lionel. Dear Richard." Beat passed. The room cooled. Miss Marple folded her hands. "You see, someone sat at that table without truly partaking. Someone who was present solely to watch, to ensure the performance of Lionel's presence went uninterrupted. Someone who, when Lionel slumped slightly in his chair, rearranged the lavender to conceal it. And that someone wasn't Mildred. Was Richard, and you, Mr. Stokes, helped him do it." Stokes stood abruptly. "This is outrageous." Reverend Pilbeam shifted in his seat. Pamela gasped. Miss Marple remained very still. "Sit down, Mr. Stokes," said a voice from the hall. "Inspector." Crayford stepped forward, flanked by 2 constables. "The house was being watched," he said calmly. "We saw Richard enter through the garden gate an hour ago. He's here, upstairs, and you, Julian Stokes, you've just confirmed that you were present during the act of concealment. That makes you complicit in fraud, if not murder." Stokes turned, made as if to move, then slumped back into his chair. "I didn't kill him," he muttered. "I only helped afterwards. Richard said it was a heart attack. He swore it. I didn't know." Miss Marple looked at him gently. "You may not have known the whole truth, but you chose not to ask, did you?" Fanshawe was taken into custody. Within the hour, he offered no resistance, no apology. It's only a single cryptic phrase as he was led away. "She always loved the house more than she loved me," whether he meant Mildred or something else entirely. No one could say. Miss Marple returned to her cottage before dusk, where she poured herself a small glass of sherry and placed her notes in a fresh envelope marked to be burned. Some truths, she knew, were better left uncatalogued. But as she stood at the window, quiet, watching the first crows gather above the trees, she whispered. All it took was one invitation too many, okay, and one guest too few. Chapter 10. The reflection in the parlor glass the following week. Aldrula slowly began to breathe again. The scandal had torn through the village with the quiet violence of a sudden frost leaving. Some flowers wilted, others hardened, and a few entirely uprooted. The chase, the cottage where Richard Fanshawe had hidden, was already back on the market. Julian Stokes had resigned from every committee in which he'd once been an uncheckable fixture. And Mrs. Mildred Fanshawe, though legally exonerated from any charge, had withdrawn from society altogether. Miss Marple did not gloat, did not offer smug pronouncements, and made no speeches about justice. She simply returned to her garden, her knitting, and her close reading of human character, which, as she often remarked, was altogether more revealing than any criminal report. But on the third evening after the last constable left the village, Mildred came to call. She looked smaller than before. Not physically, but in the way one appears after a burden has both been lifted and exposed. She wore no makeup, no pearls, and held her hand back like it might slip from her grasp at any moment. "I wanted to thank you," she said, standing in Miss Marple's sitting room, her voice low and calm. "Not for what you did, exactly, but for seeing what I couldn't." Miss Marple, seated beside the fire, looked up gently. "You loved your husband," she said. "I did, but I also loved the idea of belonging, of being the Lady of the Laurels. After Edwin died, I clung to it. I thought if I lost that, I'd be nothing again. That's what Richard saw. That's what he used." "He was clever," Miss Marple agreed, "but too clever. People who rely solely on deception never understand how plainly motive can shine through silence." Mildred nodded. "He made me believe I had killed Lionel, that I had to help him hide it, and I did." "You concealed what you thought was a death from guilt," Miss Marple said kindly, not knowing that the crime had already occurred. "But guilt, my dear, is sometimes the most honest reaction a person can have. It means you are not like him." Mildred's hands trembled. "What happens now?" "Now," Miss Marple offered her a cup of tea. "Now the truth rests, and so must you." They sat quietly for several minutes. Outside, dusk was falling over the hedges and rooftops, and the first owl had begun to call from the far orchard. Finally, Mildred rose. "I think I'll go to London, to stay with my cousin for a while." "That sounds very sensible." Mildred hesitated at the door. Do you think Edwin ever knew what Richard was truly like?" Miss Marple's voice was soft but unwavering. "I think he suspected. That's why he tried to change the will, to protect you." Mildred nodded once, then left without another word. Later that night, Miss Marple returned to her notebook. The fire was crackling low, and the village beyond her lace-curtained windows had settled into its usual quiet hum. She opened to the final page and wrote in her fine, steady script, "Case summary. The third invitation motive, greed, masked as loyalty. Method, poison in wine, means stage dinner to disguise the timing of death. Accomplice, Julian Stokes, complicit in the concealment. Catalyst, the revised will favoring Mildred. Mistake, overconfidence and underestimating memory. Justice, arrest, confession, and withdrawal of deceit. Lesson, even the most polite invitations may lead to deadly conclusions." She paused, then wrote one final line. "It is not always the loudest cry that signals danger. Sometimes it is the seat left quietly unclaimed." She closed the book, set it beside the clock, turned out the lamp. In Aldrula, peace had returned, but it was the kind of peace that follows a storm, not one that forgets the thunder. And Miss Marple, in her modest chair beside the hearth, remained gentle, quiet, and infinitely observant. "Was showing me notes this morning." Miss Marple's lips curved into a slight smile. "Then you see why I thought it important to deliver it. It is too fine a piece to have simply fallen from a coat and been carried on the wind. Colonel Bantry sighed. It is all so bewildering. I only hope the inspector will soon have answers. Miss Marple inclined her head and offered a reassuring nod. We shall see, Colonel. In the meantime, I shall pay my respects to the departed, and perhaps discover something the inspector might have overlooked. She stepped up the path, leaving Colonel Bantry and the constable exchanging uncertain glances. The door to Mr. Carrick's study lay open, a faint, stale smell of antiseptic drifting out. Inside, the desk remained scattered with papers, photographs of ancient ruins, sketches of classical architecture, and several open books on antiquities. A shattered vial lay among them, its contents dried to a dark stain. The chair, toppled backward, indicated the moment of collapse, for perhaps a struggle. Miss Marple's sharp eyes took it all in, a half-smudged fingerprint on the polished desktop, footprints in the dust by the window ledge, and, on the hearth's edge, a single wine-colored glove. She knelt to inspect the floorboards, noticing a minute fragment of fabric caught in the carpet's fringe. At that moment, Detective Inspector Peters entered, trenchcoat draped over his arm, notebook in hand. Miss Marple, he said briskly, nodding in acknowledgement. I'm grateful for your assistance. I understand you have something for me. She retrieved the glass button from her pocket and held it out. I thought it might be of use. It seems connected to Mr. Carrick's wardrobe, but I have my doubts someone here wore such ornamentation. Peters closed his notebook. I have found no button identical to this among his possessions. However, I do find it intriguing that you retrieved it from your garden. Suggests someone may have passed through here, possibly from your home to Brook Cottage, or vice versa. Miss Marple stood, smoothing her skirt. Fair observation. Someone did cross my garden. It was not for a simple stroll. And if the button truly belongs to the assailant, then the path between our houses has been more than a boundary, it has been a conduit for malice. Inspector Peters frowned. I shall have the button analyzed for any trace substances. Come. What may, Miss Marple. I value your insights. She inclined her head. As do I, Inspector. Do be sure to look at the footprints in the ivy, the smudge on the desk, and that glove by the hearth. Small things reveal larger truths. With a final nod, she turned and walked back toward her own gate, thoughts shifting like puzzle pieces seeking their place. The brass knocker on her cottage door echoed in her mind, an unspoken promise that the quiet rhythms of village life would soon be appended by revelations older and more sinister than anyone imagined. And as she stepped beneath the laburnum tree, its golden blossoms wilting in autumn's descent, Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with the eager light of investigation. She had found her first clue, and she intended to follow it wherever it might lead. 90. Miss Marple and the Mystery of the Glass Button, Chapter 11. A Button in the A.V. Miss Marple sat on her favorite garden bench beneath the old laburnum tree, her knitting needles clicking with a comforting rhythm. The air in St. Mary Mead was still cool in the early October morning, the hedges trimmed neatly, and the remnants of dawn's mist clinging to the dew-tipped rose petals. She glanced over the neatly pruned beds, content with the orderly rows of chrysanthemums and asters. The village, for all its amiable charm, had a habit of surprising even its most observant residents, especially when secrets lay hidden beneath the surface of its prim facades. As she cast her gaze down the garden path, she noticed Matthew Pegram, the young gardener employed by Colonel Bantry, bending low by the stone boundary wall that separated her little plot from Brook Cottage. He lifted something small and glistening from within the ivy's tangled embrace. Miss Marple's curiosity was immediately aroused. She slipped off her bench, keening the lad closer with a gentle wave of her knitting wrist. "Good morning, Matthew," she called, her voice soft but carrying across the crisp air. "Have you found something of interest?" Matthew straightened, brushing a tendril of autumn foliage from his hair. In his gloved hand lay a tiny glass button, its polished surface catching a shaft of morning sunshine and scattering fragments of rainbow across his palm. It was no ordinary clothing fastener. The glass was impossibly clear, with a delicately etched pattern resembling frost dancing on a windowpane. "It's quite remarkable, Miss Marple," he said, extending his hand for her to inspect. "I was snipping away at that old ivy, and it seemed to have caught on something. I thought it might be a marble at first, but it's a button. I've never seen glass buttons like this in the village." Miss Marple took the button between her fingers, examining its fine craftsmanship. "It does seem out of the ordinary. A glass button, perhaps Victorian, or even earlier. Hardly something one expects to find lying beside a hedge." She turned the button gently, letting the facets catch the light. "Do you know if anyone nearby has clothes adorned with such finery?" "It's unlikely to belong to a common frock," Matthew shrugged. "Not that I'm aware of, ma'am. I'll bring it over to Mrs. Bantry when she comes for tea. She might know something." Miss Marple nodded, tucking the button into the pocket of her cardigan. "Very good. But keep it safe. So easily dropped objects can sometimes belong to people one would least imagine." As Matthew departed down the garden path, Miss Marple watched him with mild amusement. He was a dutiful lad, but the spark of excitement in his eyes suggested he'd rather enjoyed the notion of a small mystery in their otherwise tranquil village. She returned to her bench, resumed her knitting, and allowed her mind to wander among the possibilities. Shortly thereafter, her neighbor's discreet horn announced a visitor, her niece, Lucinda Harper, who had come to borrow a teaspoon and chat about an upcoming village fete. Lucinda's hair was tousled with worry as she swept into the garden, her bright eyes reddened from tears. Miss Marple set aside her knitting. "What troubles you, my dear?" she inquired, patting the bench beside her. Lucinda lowered herself onto the seat, fussing with the hem of her skirt. "Can't Jane? It's awful an elderly gentleman named Mr. Theodore Carrick was found dead in his study at Brook Cottage yesterday evening. They're saying it was a heart attack." But she hesitated, glancing toward the Bantry's gate. "Some people believe it might not have been natural." Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled. She raised a delicately arched eyebrow. "Mr. Carrick, you say? He was rather a reclusive man, wasn't he? The retired museum curator who moved here last winter?" "Precisely. His study door was locked from the inside. The police broke it open when he failed to respond to ties for dinner. They found him slumped over his desk, a small vial shattered at his feet." "A shattered vial," Miss Marple murmured, recalling the curious asceticism. Mr. Carrick had maintained no alcohol in the house, only antique vases and framed etchings of archaeological digs. "Do they know what was in it?" "They say it contained some kind of herbal tincture perhaps. He brewed his own remedies. But the local doctor, Dr. Spence, refuses to make any statement beyond natural causes. Yet Dr. Reynolds from Market Bland said himself that Carrick's pulse was strong only hours before his tea, and the tincture's residue tested positive for belladonna, of all things." Miss Marple leaned forward, steepling her fingers. "Belladonna is no simple remedy. It can cause cardiac arrest in sufficient dosages. If Dr. Reynolds is correct, then this was no accident." Lucinda shivered at her aunt's implication. "That's what everyone's whispering, but who would want to kill Mr. Carrick? He barely knew anyone." "That is exactly why suspicion can be so cunning," Miss Marple replied quietly. "In a village the size of ours, where everyone knows, or thinks they know one another, a person can be rendered invisible. A stranger, even a gentle one, might carry dark shadows with him." Lucinda glanced toward the ivy-covered boundary wall. "I found the police officer at Brook Cottage this morning, searching the grounds. They said they were looking for a clue. They didn't mention up by the wall, but something caught my eye." Miss Marple interrupted. "A button, perhaps?" Lucinda looked startled. "How did you know?" I saw young Matthew discreetly returning to his work a short while ago when I found that curious button. It struck me as odd, especially considering Mr. Carrick's demise. There is too fine a line between chance and design, where secrets and accidents intertwine. Lucinda paled. Do you think the button belongs to his killer? Miss Marple folded her knitting in her lap, drawing a slow breath. I'm not certain, but it would be wise to keep it. It may turn out to be the link between a nameless person and Mr. Carrick's final moments. As though on cue, Mrs. Dolly Bantry appeared at her garden gate. Her parasol tipped jauntily as she strolled across the lawn. Good morning, Jane, she called. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, Dolly, Miss Marple replied, rising to greet her. Lucinda has news that requires our collective attention. She recounted the circumstances of Mr. Carrick's death and showed the glass button. Dolly peered through her pince-nez and pursed her lips. That's rather like the trimming on an antique opera coat my cousin brought to the sale last year. He said it came from a traveling troupe, late 19th century. But why would such a thing be here? She paused, casting her eyes at Brook Cottage. This further complicates things. Our village is not accustomed to such darkness. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed, we must be cautious. I shall walk down to Brook Cottage later, if only to pay respects to the poor man and observe the scene for myself. Sometimes the most subtle details escape the eye of authority, especially in matters they wish to close swiftly. Dowling laid a comforting hand on Miss Marple's elbow. You always notice what everyone else misses. Just be careful, dear. I have a feeling this is only the beginning of something far more tangled. Cinda rose, smoothing her skirt. Should go. Prepare tea. I'll bring it over to you in a bit, Aunt Jane. I can't bear to linger here. Lucinda hurried away. Miss Marple, Dolly, and Matthew, who had reappeared with a trowel, stood in thoughtful silence. Its glass button, cradled in Miss Marple's hand, gleamed like a sliver of truth waiting to be found. The village of St. Mary Mead, where crime was ordinarily as rare as a Fogels's morning in autumn, now held within its ivy-draped walls a mystery that would test both her understanding of human nature and her unwavering intuition. Miss Marple looked from the button to the winding path that led to Brook Cottage, and remembered, with a faint smile, how the simplest objects often carried the gravest of secrets. She tucked the button safely into her pocket, secured her knitting under her arm, and set off across the lawn. With each measured step, she felt the familiar thrill of anticipation. There was, she thought, no more satisfying pursuit than uncovering the truth buried beneath polite smiles and genteel facades. And in St. Mary Mead, particularly on a morning like this, those facades could only hold for so long. She emerged onto the meandering footpath lined with hedgerows, the soft crunch of fallen leaves beneath her slippers. The red brick facade of Brook Cottage came into view, its windows shuttered and a front door ajar. A uniformed constable stood guard, chatting quietly with Colonel Bantry, who had arrived only moments before, his expression a taut mask of confusion and concern. Miss Marple inclined her head to both men. Good morning, Colonel. May I have a word? Colonel Bantry removed his hat and stepped aside with a grave bow. Of course, Miss Marple, we were just discussing how Mr. Carrick came to be in such a state. I still cannot believe it. Understand, Miss Marple said gently. The police have assured me they will do all they can. But sometimes it is the unremarkable item's single button, a broken vial that illuminates the darkest corners of our hearts. The constable regarded her curiously. A button, you say? We've not found anything like that, Miss Marple. She tapped her pocket. I discovered this half an hour ago in my garden, close to the ivy that separates us. I thought it best to bring it here. Seems oddly pristine, unlikely to have been here long. Constable's eyes narrowed as Miss Marple produced the button. He examined it through the lens of an eyeglass, then glanced at Colonel Bantry. "That matches the description of the one found in Mr. Carrick's study, I believe. Det. Inspector Peter." Chapter 12. Shadows among neighbors. Miss Marple awoke at dawn with renewed purpose. Scotch. She prepared tea, placing the glass button where morning light could catch its facets. Over breakfast, she resolved to visit Colonel and Mrs. Bantry and speak with Inspector Peters. She walked briskly to the Bantry's house. The autumn air felt sharp as she approached. Mrs. Bantry waited on her veranda, worry etched on her face. "Good morning, Jane. I'm glad you've come," Dolly Bantry greeted, leading Miss Marple inside the porch. The air was crisp, and the leaves around them rustled like distant whispers of gossip yet to unfold. "Let us discuss what remains," Miss Marple said. They settled at a small table set for tea, and Mrs. Annie's soon served scones and jam. The china seemed fragile in Dolly's trembling hands. Miss Marple began. "Who were Mr. Carrick's last visitors?" Dolly stirred her tea, her eyes distant. "Mr. Gilchrist, the antique dealer, and later Mrs. Evelyn Pease from Bath." Aldrich said. "Carrick seemed well after both calls. I noticed a stiffness in his manner, with Gilchrist some disagreement about a relic's value." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Arguments over value can hide deeper resentments." She paused to sip her tea, noticing Dolly's pale complexion. Did he remove his velvet coat with glass buttons? Dolly's frown deepened. He planned to replace the buttons today. He mentioned it to Aldrich. "Then someone may have stolen a button," Miss Marple deduced. "Bill Bantry is home from the RAF. His observations may prove useful. I intend to visit Gilchrist's shop, and Bill's presence could offer a sturdier viewpoint." Moments later, Bill Bantry arrived, crate in hand. "Miss Marple, Dolly asked me to come." She smiled. "Bill, I found this in my garden." She offered the button. Bill examined it, noting how light splintered into a prism. "Remarkable craftsmanship," Bill said. "I've never seen glass like it." They match Carrick's coat," Miss Marple confirmed. "Let us go to Market Bland." On the drive, the world beyond the village unfolded. Mist curled above fields, bordered with hedgerows of flame in autumn. Hues amber, russet, and gold. Cows grazed placidly, unaware of human schemes. The road wound past thatched cottages and silent barns, a tapestry of rural calm at odds with their urgent quest. Gilchrist's antique shop stood modestly between a bakery and a draper's. The window displayed silver candlesticks tarnished by time and a cracked porcelain figurine. Inside, the air was musty with varnish. Hand rays of sunlight slanted through dusty panes, illuminating motes that danced like tiny specters. Gilchrist emerged from a back room, pince-nez perched at his nose. He wore a linen jacket, smudged with dust from polishing oak frames. "Miss Marple, Bill Bantry." A surprise. "What can I do for you?" Miss Marple showed the button. "Mr. Gilchrist, these belong to Carrick's coat. Do they look familiar?" Gilchrist peered through his magnifier. "Indeed. Sold that coat to Carrick last autumn. He wished to have new buttons cast from Murano glass. He intended to return these today." "How did you come by one?" Bill interjected. "It appeared in Miss Marple's garden." Someone must have removed one early." Gilchrist's brow furrowed. He claimed to keep the coat in his wardrobe. "Someone took a button. They accessed his room." Miss Marple nodded. "Which acquaintances knew of his plan?" "Lapis, Mrs. Pease, and Mr. Aldrich," Gilchrist replied. He was discreet. "Thank you," Miss Marple said. She slipped the button into a small box. Back in St. Mary Mead, the sky brightened after rain. They walked to Brook Cottage. Inspector Peters allowed them to see Aldrich in the drawing room, where afternoon sun fell in dusty squares across the carpet. "Mr. Aldrich," Miss Marple began, "did Carrick wear his coat yesterday? Were the buttons intact?" He rubbed his temples. "He returned at midday, changed into a wool jacket for the chill. The velvet coat hung in his wardrobe, buttons untouched. By evening, it was gone. Miss Marple pressed. Any sign of forced entry? Aldrich shook his head. None. Windows latched, door locked. He was careful. Did he receive late-night visitors or make calls? Miss Marple asked. He made many calls, always in hushed tones. Aldrich admitted. I never saw the person on the other end. Bill set down the glove found by the hearth. Inspector Peters said this was discovered near the fireplace. Marple took the glove, noting its fine stitching. A visitor's glove, not his. Aldrich's expression tightened. Only Mrs. P's owned gloves like these. Miss Marple exchanged a look with Bill. We must speak with her. They left Brook Cottage. Outside, the village life seemed untroubled children playing in schoolyards, shopkeepers arranging wares. Yet Miss Marple knew beneath the peaceful veneer lay envy and old rivalries. They paused at the post office. Lupin West, the postmistress, greeted them behind the counter. Miss Marple. Mr. Bantry no mail for Carrick since yesterday, Lupin said, rummaging beneath piles of letters. But here is one addressed to Mrs. Pease from Carrick. He sent it last week. Miss Marple accepted the letter. He invited her on an expedition. She never collected it. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple laid out her evidence, the button, the glove, and the letter. Candlelight flickered across their surfaces as she traced connections in her mind. The button had been placed deliberately to implicate a phantom. The glove pointed to a woman's possible presence in the study, and the letter bore the sting of rejection. Bill offered the telephone records given by the inspector. Here are the numbers he called. Miss Marple scanned them. We shall review these tonight. Tomorrow, I will telephone Mrs. Pease myself. She paused. If she resented his refusal, she could be suspect. But if not, someone is framing her. Bill leaned forward. What about Gilchrist? He argued with Carrick over a relic's authenticity. He might bear a grudge. Yet framing him would be obvious. Our culprit likely seeks to venerate cunning by diverting suspicion. The fire crackled as Miss Marple poured fresh tea. She regarded the item spread before her, a small glass button bearing hidden intent, a single leather glove stained with more than dirt, and a letter folded with the pangs of wounded pride. The three objects, innocuous alone, together hinted at collusion, betrayal, and cold calculation. Tomorrow held their next movement, confronting Mrs. Pease, questioning Gilchrist further, and scrutinizing late-night calls. For now, they would wait, watch, and prepare. In St. Mary Mead, the night seemed a gentle respite, but Miss Marple knew darkness only concealed more than it revealed. She closed the curtains, leaving the button's facets to catch the glow of the lamp one last time. And as the village drifted into silent slumber, she sat in quiet reflection, ever watchful, ever ready to discern the faint threads that would reveal the murderer's identity. For though St. Mary Mead slept, Miss Marple's mind wandered through corridors of suspicion, resolving that by morning the mask of innocence would fall. The button, however, does not fit her coat. We must ask Gilchrist if any other coats matching that style were in circulation. If not, she may have worn Carrick's own coat before returning it to his wardrobe. Bill frowned. She could have retrieved a button, planted it near your cottage, and worn a glove that paid a visit to the study, then left under the pretense of the lecture. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Exactly. We shall follow each thread. But now we must see Mrs. Hargreaves. She lives on Paragon Street, not far from here. We will present the glove to her, observe her reaction. She knows nothing of gloves or Anatolian expeditions. She will show surprise. If she feigned innocence, we shall see it in her eyes. Just then, Mrs. Pease re-entered the room, closing a heavy, leather-bound volume with a soft thud. Are you ready, Miss Marple? She asked. Miss Marple rose. Yes, thank you for your hospitality. We shall be in touch. She offered a curt, polite nod. Evelyn's eyes glimmered with something possible relief, possibly victory. Miss Marple catalogued the subtle shift in expression. Satisfaction mingled with unease. The platter of tea cakes on the side table remained untouched, as though dinner had distracted her from sustenance. Miss Marple smelled a faint aroma of gardenias, likely from a vase on the mantel that could explain the glove's pollen. The three left together, descending the creaking staircase. Mrs. Pease walked beside them to the door, dropping polite pleasantries into the morning air. Once outside, she paused, adjusting her gloves as though to steady her composure. Miss Marple, Mr. Bantry, you must forgive my initial skepticism, she said. I can be of any further assistance, perhaps clarifying the exact wording of my reply to Carrick. Do not hesitate to write. I shall expedite my response. Miss Marple inclined her head, expression inscrutable. Thank you, Mrs. Pease. It is possible we shall take you up on that. With a final nod, they stepped into the street as they walked briskly toward Mrs. Hargreaves's address. Miss Marple told Bill, it is clear she feels threatened by our questions. She wishes to wrap herself in the cloak of propriety so that suspicions fade, but it is precisely that cloak that betrays her when she thinks no one is looking. Bill glanced down at his watch. We have time for one more call. Should we ring Inspector Peters with what we've learned? Miss Marple shook her head, a determined look in her eyes. Not yet. Let him continue investigations here. We'll gather Mrs. Hargreaves's testimony first. Only then will we piece together how the glass button and glove conspired to deliver Carrick's undoing. They turned a corner onto Paragon Street, where a red brick townhouse bore a small brass plaque. Mrs. Hargreaves' Historical Research, room rentals available. Miss Marple lifted a gloved hand and knocked gently 3 times. Waited. And soon the door opened to reveal a woman in mourning gray, her hair streaked with silver through a tight sheen. She offered a warm but weary smile. Miss Marple, Mr. Bantry, she said, I've heard of your visit. Please, come in. She led them into a parlor dominated by bookshelves laden with Victorian histories and faded photos of Hargreaves's former lectures. Miss Marple seated herself directly across from Mrs. Hargreaves and laid the leather glove on the table between them. Mrs. Hargreaves, can you tell me where you were between 8 and 10:30 last night? The widow nodded, pursing her lips. I was preparing lecture notes for the following week. No one saw me, as I work late in the evening. I make tea at 9, sometimes 10. She touched the glove lightly. This is not mine. Bill leaned forward. Did you lend your gloves to Mrs. Pease? Or perhaps visit Brook Cottage yourself? Mrs. Hargreaves's eyes widened. Never. I have my own gloves, embroidered with silver thread, not this dark leather. I did encourage Evelyn to stand up to Carrick's presumptions, but I would never go there after dusk. Miss Marple dropped the glove back into her satchel. Thank you for your honesty, Mrs. Hargreaves. Your assistance helps me narrow the field. If you recall any detail, perhaps hearing voices or knowing someone who resented Carrick, please let me know. Mrs. Hargreaves inclined her head solemnly. Of course, I will write if anything occurs to me. As they rose to depart, Miss Marple thanked her again and felt the widow's genuine sorrow and reluctance to be drawn deeper into the affair. Outside, the rustling of fallen leaves and distant tolling of Bath Abbey's bells created a somber backdrop. Miss Marple tapped her chin thoughtfully. Mrs. Pease's timeline places her at the lecture hall by 8:15, but Carrick's death occurred sometime after 10. That leaves a gap. Yet if she returned, she would have had to pass through the courtyard behind Brook Cottage, where no one saw her ring a button, leave a glove, and administer belladonna to Carrick's tea. The route is possible, but only if Carrick let her in willingly. Bill adjusted his collar. So she either convinced him to let her back inside, or someone else let her in. Then she never used her own glove, but perhaps slipped on a different glove to avoid leaving fingerprints. Miss Marple gave a faint nod, a classic misdirection. The button's pristine condition suggests it was planted rather than dropped during haste. The culprit may have stolen one early, kept it ready to discard near your cottage. But for now, we have enough to cast suspicion on Mrs. Pease. Let us return to St. Mary, Mead, and share our findings with Inspector Peters. They walked briskly to the car, the morning mist rising from the Avon River as they passed Pulteney Bridge. The city stirred around them, shopkeepers opening windows of sweeps, the rumble of a brewer's cart, distant laughter of children on their way to school. But in Miss Marple's mind, the laughter was tempered by the knowledge that beneath Bathurst's beautiful facade lay envy, wounded pride, and crimes carefully orchestrated. As Bill slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, Miss Marple fastened her satchel, feeling the weight of the 3 critical items inside each, a silent witness to Carrick's final hours. She glanced toward Bill, determination in her eyes. By the time we return to St. Mary Mead, Inspector Peters will be ready for conclusive evidence. Tomorrow, we shall see where Mrs. Pease's true loyalties lie. They set off once more into the winding roads that led back to their village, leaving behind Bathurst's Georgian elegance and the uncertain shadows it held. And, as the morning sun pierced the clouds overhead, Miss Marple felt the promise of revelation looming on the horizon. Chapter 13. The lady from Bath. Miss Marple rose before dawn the following morning, stirred from slumber by a thought that would not let her rest. The sky outside her window was still a muted gray, the first light of October filtering through the curtains. She dressed with quiet deliberation, her favorite periwinkle dress, a woolen cardigan and sensible shoesand, paused by the mantel to gather the 3 objects she had laid out the previous evening: the glass button, a leather glove, and the unopened letter addressed to Mrs. Evelyn Pease. She tucked the button into a small, velvet-lined box, wrapped the glove carefully in tissue, and folded the letter once more, placing all 3 inside her saddle-mitts. Later, Bill Bantry arrived to accompany her on the journey to Bath. The air was crisp enough to catch their breath as they walked from St. Mary Mead's village square to Bill's Morris Minor, parked quietly beneath the elm tree where Matthew had polished it until it gleamed. Bill carried a satchel of his own, containing telephone records and any notes Inspector Peters had provided. They climbed into the car, and soon the engine purred, carrying them westward down narrow country lanes. As they traversed fields where the mist still clung to hedgerows, Miss Marple set her mind to what awaited them. "I believe Mrs. Pease will claim she never intended harm," she said, fingers lightly tapping the steering wheel. "Yet the glove in Carrick's study does not appear to belong to her. It's too fine, too slender, a glove for evening wear, not a morning's social call. We must ascertain where she was at the hour of Carrick's death, and how she obtained such an item." Bill nodded, his expression earnest. Inspector Peters noted that Carrick's last phone call went to a Bath exchange after 10 at night. Mrs. Pease admitted calling him that evening, but she says the conversation was brief and purely to confirm details of their expedition. No mention of any button or glove. Naturally, Miss Marple allowed a small smile to cross her lips. Belladonna kills swiftly, without warning. Anyone can claim a brief conversation and escape culpability, if only words could dissolve evidence so easily. We shall see what contradictions her words reveal. They rode on in silence for several minutes, the landscape changing from gently rolling fields to stone bridges and low, limestone hills as they neared Bath. By the time they reached the outskirts of the city, early morning traffic had begun to stir. Bathurst's grand Georgian terraces glowed faintly in the pale light. Narrow side streets, paved unevenly, led toward the heart of the old city, where shops were just unlocking their doors. Miss Marple guided Bill down one such cobbled lane until they arrived at a modest lodging house bearing a brass plaque. Mrs. E. Pease, visiting professor of archaeology accommodations by appointment. The building's facade was painted in subdued cream, the windows trimmed in worn oak. She waited while Bill obtained a permit to park nearby, then stepped onto the pavement and made her way to the front door. A bell chimed sharply as she lifted the knocker, and she stood composed, surveying the street with keen eyes. A moment later, footsteps sounded within, and the door opened to reveal Mrs. Evelyn Pease herself, dressed in a tailored tweed suit that gave her an air of restrained elegance. Her hair, the color of burnished copper, was pinned to reveal a widow's knot at the nape of her neck, and her green eyes widened with surprise when she saw Miss Marple and Bill. "Miss Marple, Mr. Bantry," said, her voice polite but cool. "What an unexpected pleasure. To what do I owe the honor?" Miss Marple inclined her head, producing a small calling card. "Mrs. Pease, I hope you will forgive our intrusion. I came to discuss the circumstances surrounding Theodore Carrick's passing. I found this letter addressed to you in his study and wished to return it in person." She offered the folded envelope. Mrs. Pease's gloved hand trembled slightly as she accepted it. "Carrick, my dear Mr. Carrick sent this weeks ago. I never collected it. I had assumed he would deliver it when next in Bath." Bill cleared his throat and held out the leather glove. "This was found in Mr. Carrick's study, next to a shattered vial. It is women's evening wear, Mrs. Pease. Can you explain why your glove should be there?" A flash of color rose in Mrs. Pease's cheeks, and she drew back a step. "I never wore that glove to his home. It must have blown in from somewhere. Or perhaps another Mrs. Pease owns a similar pair." She raised her chin, maintaining a facade of dignity that did not quite reach her eyes. Miss Marple's gaze remained unflinching. "The glove bears faint traces of dust and, perhaps, a residue of dried pollen. Suggest it was not freshly laundered. It had been worn maybe earlier that day before carrying something from Carrick's hallway. But the principal question is, why would you, who were merely planning this expedition, leave such a glove in his study?" Mrs. Pease lifted her chin further, as though to escape scrutiny. "I do not know. I assure you, I have no idea how it arrived there." She glanced at Bill, then at Miss Marple. "I have been preparing for an evening lecture. I must have dropped it at the carriage entrance when leaving Carrick's house. I apologetically left in haste because I needed to prepare notes. I did not discover the loss until this morning." Miss Marple made a mental note. On that evening, Evelyn Pease left Carrick's home before dusk, carrying her documents. Yet, Carrick's death is estimated at around 10:30, based on Aldridge's recollection of hearing the carriage leave and the doctor's estimation. If she left earlier, she should not have had reason to be there after that hour. Miss Marple smiled gently. "Then forgive me if I appear overly suspicious, but I must confirm your exact timeline. At what time did you leave Brook Cottage?" she asked. Mrs. Pease drew her wrist across her forehead, as if warding off an inconvenient recollection. "I left precisely at 8 o'clock, as I had an engagement with colleagues at Bath University." Bill produced a small notebook. "Do you have anyone who can vouch for your presence at the lecture? A colleague or the proctor?" Mrs. Pease's shoulders tensed. "Several professors were present," she said. "Professor Hill sat beside me. If you would confirm that I entered the lecture hall at 8:15. She hesitated and glanced toward the stairwell. "Shall we move inside? It is rather chilly here." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course." She followed Mrs. Pease into a sitting room paneled in dark oak, furnished with bookcases burdened by ancient tomes and a chaise lounge upholstered in crimson velvet. A fire smoldered low on the hearth, its embers glowing softly. On a small side table stood a porcelain vase filled with forget-me-nots, their petals still fresh from the florist's early delivery. Mrs. Pease directed them to sit in overstuffed chairs by the fire. She poured tea from a silver pot, her motions precise and controlled. So Miss Marple watched as she placed 2 fine china cups on saucers etched with floral patterns. When the servant withdrew, Miss Marple leaned forward. Mrs. Pease, you will recall that Carrick invited you to join him on an archaeological expedition in Anatolia. He mentioned sharing new findings of a dig in the letter you received, but he also hinted at disappointment when you declined. Is that correct? Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. It is true. I declined because I am committed to my professorship. Returning to Anatolia so soon would mean relinquishing my teaching responsibilities. Miss Marple held the letter aloft. In your reply, did you express gratitude? Or did you use a more abrupt phrase such as how your priorities lay elsewhere? Mrs. Pease's eyes flickered. I cannot recall my exact wording. I simply stated that my commitments here precluded me from joining him. I did not intend to cause offense. Yet he wrote back, your refusal wounds me more than you know. Miss Marple recited, having memorized that sentence. She laid the letter on her knee. Such a phrase can bruise pride. Did you perceive it as a slight? Evelyn paused, then exhaled. Yes, I suppose I did. If a man of his stature alone, perhaps lonely, invites you, one does not expect rejection. I was hurt by his assumption that I would sacrifice my career for him, but I would never harm him. You must believe me. Miss Marple's lips curved in a compassionate half-smile. I understand. But consider this. If your pride was wounded, you might have sought a measure of retribution, though not necessarily lethal. Suppose you confided in someone else about your grievance, and that person took it upon themselves to punish Carrick. Mrs. Pease's fingers stilled on the teacup. Her gaze dropped to the patterned rug at her feet. I shared my disappointment with a close friend, Mrs. Hargreaves, widow of the late Professor Hargreaves. She visited me there at Bath University. But she would not stoop to violence. She only suggested he was foolish to assume a woman would abandon her profession for a man she saw only at intervals. She looked up, her eyes glistening. That is all. Miss Marple inclined her head. Then we shall speak with Mrs. Hargreaves as well. I thank you for your candor, Mrs. Pease. It is nothing to admit wounded feelings. The truth often hides in plain sight behind such sentiments. Bill reached forward, standing and extending his hand. Thank you, Mrs. Pease. We should take our leave. She rose, smoothing her skirt, and excused herself to retrieve a book from the shelf. While she was away, Miss Marple turned to Bill and spoke quietly. There is something in her manner I find not quite right. A woman's pride can descend to clever deceptions. The gloves, pollen likely from a flower arrangement in Carrick's study, could have adhered to her as she leaned over his desk.
Miss Marple moved toward the back door and opened it, revealing the narrow garden path she had walked that morning. The ground was softened by rain earlier in the day, and the footprints remained visible, 2 sets, one matching Mrs. Pease's shoe size, another larger, likely belonging to Carrick himself or his valet. She knelt, inspecting the indentation, then rose and walked the path in the opposite direction, measuring the time it would take to cross under dim moonlight. Less than 5 minutes. Inspector Peters shone his torch on a cluster of rose thorns near the garden wall. Here's where I found that fragment of navy wool. He pointed to a minuscule scrap nearly the color of midnight caught on a thorn. Miss Marple picked it up with gloved fingers and held it to the lamp, confirming the deep hue. She turned and approached the front door, then paused, listening. The house was silent, aside from the steady drip of water from the roof's gutter. She walked back to the study, where she found the chair Carrick had collapsed in still overturned, its legs faintly marked by scratches in the floorboards. She knelt before the desk, where a faint smudge of fingerprint lingered near an open ledger. She held a gloved finger near it, considering. Then, in the corner of her eye, she noticed 2 small holes in the wallpaper behind the chair puncture marks, likely from a needle or fine wire used to suspend the lamp at Carrick's desk. No lamp would produce splinters like these, she murmured. She traced the marks with a gloved fingertip. Someone wanted him to look down at something, perhaps to conceal what they did. She rose and turned to Inspector Peters. See how the punctures are at Carrick's head height when seated. One could have used a thin cord to lower a small vial of belladonna into his tea. He would have thought he spilled it himself from a trembling hand. Peters bent to inspect, and Bill leaned close, astonished. Ingenious, Peters admitted. But it leaves evidence, these holes in the wall, the fallen petals that crumbled underfoot. I overlooked them. Miss Marple gave him a faint smile. Often we overlook what we do not expect. A murder method so subtle it assumes its own concealment. Now, if we can match the glove pollen to a gardenia bush near where Mrs. Pease walked, we confirm her presence. But the path itself gives us enough. She crossed silently, wearing Carrick's velvet coat, replaced it with her own, and returned home so that few would know she was there. Bill shook his head. The wool coat fragment proves someone returned a decoy. The button you found in my aunt's garden was planted, presumably, by Mrs. Pease to throw us off her trail. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, she wished to implicate someone else, or give the illusion of carelessness, that the button had fallen of its own accord, irrelevant to a crime. Yet she underestimated that patterns have meaning. One misplaced button unravels what one hopes to conceal. Inspector Peters took out his notebook and scribbled, "We should arrest her at dawn. I will question Mrs. Peaceday, if possible, but at least before she leaves Bath." Miss Marple watched the footprints in the fading lamplight. We must tread carefully. If she realizes we know, she may flee. But first, we must secure the evidence: the punctured wall, the wool fragment, the pollen on the glove. I will examine those myself tomorrow, but tonight you should photograph everything. Then, Peters, you can obtain a warrant. Peters saluted crisply. Understood. I will begin at once. Miss Marple rose, brushing dust from her skirt. She turned to Bill. Let us return to my cottage. There is much to consider, and the night grows weary. They left Brook Cottage, slipping through the garden gate as the wind whispered secrets among the hedges. The village beyond was dark and quiet, with lanterns glowing faintly behind curtained windows. Barn owls called in the distance, and the rustle of field mice scuttling in the undergrowth seemed amplified in the hush as they walked back along the lane. Miss Marple reflected on the evening's revelations, the elegance of the crime's execution, the vulnerability of trusts extended too far, and the fragile boundaries between kindness and cruelty. A single button, a stolen coat, and the perfume of gardenias had been woven into a pattern of deceit. But by uncovering these threads, she had begun to unravel a murderer's cunning. When they reached her cottage, Bill paused on the doorstep. "Jane, do you think we have enough?" Miss Marple turned to him, her eyes calm and assured. "We have more than enough, Bill. Dawn will bring clarity, and by then we shall know who placed that final button. All that remains is to gather the pieces and lay them before the court of truth." Together they stepped inside, closing the door against the chill of night. And as they settled by the hearth, with a new lamp burning softly and the scent of freshly steeped tea in the air, Miss Marple set out her satchel, ready to sort through the fragments of a case that had begun with a single glass button and would end with the revelation of a hidden heart. Chapter 14. Threads at Home. Miss Marple and Bill Bantry arrived back in St. Mary Mead as the sun dipped low, painting the hedgerows in gold and auburn hues. The journey from Bath had been quiet, each of them absorbed in thought, and now the familiar sights of the village felt heavy with expectation. They parked on the lane outside Miss Marple's cottage, where the scent of freshly brewed afternoon tea wafted through the open window. Inside, Inspector Peters was pacing the sitting room, his trench coat draped over a chair, a half-empty notebook. He looked up at their approach and straightened. "Miss Marple, Mr. Bantry," he said, closing his notebook. "I have reviewed the evidence you left, and I've also had Aldrich check the midnight telephone bills as we discussed. It seems Carrick's last call was placed at 10:03 p.m. to a Bath number, likely Mrs. Pease's, and no further calls. I was hoping you would arrive soon. I have a good mind to make an arrest before supper." Miss Marple inclined her head. "It is best to wait until we have irrefutable proof, Inspector. Mrs. Pease's own account still holds room for doubt. We must present our case clearly rather than rely on conjecture." She took a seat by the small writing desk, glancing at the framed photograph of St. Mary Mead's church on the wall. "Tell me what you have learned in my absence." Peters crossed to stand before her, his shoes clicking on the wooden floor. "I spoke with Gilchrist again. He confirms he sold Carrick 2 identical coats, one in black velvet, the other in navy wool. Only the black velvet bore glass buttons, and only Carrick requested the Murano glass replacements." He paused, as though weighing each word carefully. "I found a torn fragment of navy wool caught on a rosethorn bush along the back path to Brook Cottage. I believe someone returned the wool coat as a decoy, leaving the velvet coat accessible." He sighed. "Therefore, the button you discovered in your garden belongs to no coat Mrs. Pease ever owned. It came from Carrick's own garment." Bill leaned forward, eyebrows raised. "So Mrs. Pease must have worn his velvet coat perhaps, while he was incapacitated, and then swapped the coats so that no one would suspect at first glance. But why would she do that?" Inspector Peters ran a hand through his hair. "To create confusion, of course. Remove one velvet garment, plant the button at your home to implicate an innocent party, or to draw Miss Marple into the search. Then return the wool coat so that Carrick's valet, Aldrich, would assume his master's coat had simply been misplaced." His expression darkened. "We have the fragments, the timeline, and your testimony about the glove. Now all we need is a confession or a witness to place her at Brook Cottage after 8. Miss Marple tapped her chin. "Perhaps Mrs. Pease's servant, Mrs. Ferrer, can help. She might know when her mistress returned home last night. People often speak without remembering why. If we ask carefully, she may reveal something. We should also revisit Brook Cottage at dusk to see if any footprints along the path match hers." Peters nodded. "A sound plan. I also had Aldrich re-examine the glove. There is a faint perfume, residue gardenia, I believe. Does Mrs. Pease ever wear that scent?" Miss Marple's lips curved in agreement. Yes, she is fond of gardenias. Remember her home in Bath. The parlor was always scented by her favorite blossoms. The pollen on the glove corresponds to the flowers I saw in her sitting room. She rose and collected her satchel from the chair. Bill and I shall speak with Mrs. Ferrer now. Meanwhile, Inspector, could you secure permission to revisit Brook Cottage after dark? Perhaps the evening air will have settled, and we can spot footprints along the back path. Peters glanced at the window. It grows dark by now. I'll make the arrangements. Come back here at 6, and we'll go to Brook Cottage together. He paused, regarding Miss Marple with genuine respect. You may have saved me from hasty measures. I would rather make one sure arrest than risk letting a murderer slip through. Miss Marple smiled kindly. We must be patient, Inspector. The truth often lies beneath what we least suspect. Later that afternoon, Bill Bantry and Miss Marple walked along Green Lane to the small cottage where Mrs. Ferrer, Mrs. P's housekeeper, lived with her aging collie. The sun slanted beneath the clouds, throwing long shadows across hedgerows. Thatched roofs and dry stone walls blurred past, and the muted chirp of birds felt at odds with the gravity of their mission. When they reached Mrs. Ferrer's gate, the collie, old and gray-muzzled, wagged its tail in recognition. Mrs. Ferrer herself appeared at the porch, wiping flour from her hands. Miss Marple, Mr. Bantry, she exclaimed, with a faint gasp, dropping her tea towel on a low table. I heard of poor Mr. Carrick's passing. Such a shock. Come in, do. They stepped into her modest kitchen, whitewashed walls, copper pans hanging from beams, and the smell of freshly baked bread in the air. A kettle whistled gently on the stove. Mrs. Ferrer wiped her hands on her apron as she offered them chairs. By a small, round table, Bill took a seat and began. Mrs. Ferrer, we have questions about last night's events at Brook Cottage. You were Mrs. Pease's housekeeper and would know her schedule. Can you tell us when Mrs. Pease arrived home from Bath? Mrs. Ferrer's eyes flickered. She usually arrives by 8:30, sometimes later if the lecture runs long. But last night she came home earlier than usual, at precisely 10 minutes past 9. Miss Marple arched her brow. 10 minutes past 9, so she would have been at Brook Cottage until then. Did she go anywhere after she came in? Mrs. Ferrer's lips pressed together. No. She took off her hat and coat, black velvet. It was unsaid. She would read in the drawing room. I saw her settle into a chair with a book. Bill exchanged a quick glance with Miss Marple. Did you notice if her coat had buttons, or if it looked like the coat Mr. Carrick kept in his wardrobe? Mrs. Ferrer hesitated. It was soft velvet, I recall that, but I did not examine it closely. I thought it was her own coat. I suppose it was Carrick's. Miss Marple leaned forward. And did you ever see Mrs. Pease in that coat again? Mrs. Ferrer shook her head. No, ma'am, she wore her tweed after that. I never saw that coat again. She paused, eyes downcast. Forgive me, I didn't know it was his coat. She carried it in herself. That is, it was hanging in the hall. Bill's voice was gentle but firm. Mrs. Ferrer breathed deeply, and her eyes glistened. She was worried. She paced the hallway around 9:15, as if deciding something. I thought she had received news. When I passed by at 9:30 to ask if she wanted more tea, I saw her standing by the fireplace in the drawing room. staring at the mantel. Clock, lips pressed tight, she swallowed. After that, when I returned at 10, she was in her own room, wearing her tweed coat. She told me she had misplaced her gloves and asked if I had seen them. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Then she removed Carrick's velvet coat sometime between 9:10 and 9:30, and returned with her tweed, having placed the gloves, Mr. Carrick's gloves, perhaps in the drawing room. Then she allowed no one to see her leave the house. Mrs. Ferrer pressed her lips together. She said she was going to see Aldridge Dear, to ask about a letter that did not arrive. She left quietly at exactly 9:45, but Carrick died at around 10:30, Bill said softly. Mrs. Ferrer's gaze dropped. I did not see her return to Brook Cottage after that. I waited up until midnight in case she came in, but she never did. Miss Marple rose, tucking away her notebook. Thank you, Mrs. Ferrer. Your account confirms what we suspected. Mrs. Pease had opportunity to visit Brook Cottage after her lecture without being seen by anyone but Aldridge. You have been most helpful. Mrs. Ferrer withdrew to fetch a pot of tea, leaving the two seated with only the collie's quiet breathing as company. Bill exhaled, tension evident in his shoulders. Miss Marple rested a gentle hand on his arm. She was quite determined to conceal her movements. Now we must examine the path she likely took across the fields, through the back gate, and into Carrick's study. Do you have the farmhouse key that Aldridge turned over to Inspector Peters? Bill nodded and produced a small brass key from his pocket. Inspector asked me to bring it to you. You said you wanted to revisit Brook Cottage. Miss Marple accepted the key. We shall go now. She rose and picked up her satchel. They left Mrs. Ferrer's cottage, the collie watching them with clouded eyes, as though sensing an unsettled outcome. The sky had become a pewter gray, the horizon blurred by rolling mists. A chill breeze whispered through bare branches, and the faint clink of Millgate's church bell marked the hour of 6. Inspector Peters met them at the gate of Brook Cottage, accompanied by Aldridge, who looked contrite. The garden beyond was shrouded in dusky gloom. The climbing rose bushes drooped under the weight of fallen petals, and the old ivy crawled over the stone facade like an ancient sentinel. A carpet of dead leaves rustled with each step, and the faint smell of chamomile lingered in the air. Miss Marple produced the key and unlocked the heavy front door. Inside, Aldridge relit a single lamp, revealing a sitting room marred by the memory of tragedy. Carrick's writing desk lay empty, its surface bare but for the faint stain where the vial had shattered. The mantel above the fireplace bore the clock that had caught Mrs. Pease's attention, its hands frozen forever at 10:15. Footprints in the dust led from Thifa Airplace hearth toward the door that opened onto the back path. Several scrap pieces by his polish. Examining them with a magnifying lens, I find nothing fresh, no new chips on the work table. But recently, I did lend my lens to Mr. Hollis, returned it 2 days ago. Come to think of it, Mr. Hollis requested a second set of glass buttons for a velvet gown belonging to a GP. He did not say who. Strange, now that I think of it. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Bill. If GP corresponds to G. George Pershore, for instance, he might have acquired the buttons on Evelyn's behalf. We shall need to speak with Mr. Hollis. She slipped the box into her bag. Thank you, Mr. Gilchrist. Your assistance is invaluable. They stepped out into the first drops of a steady drizzle. Bill hailed a passing taxi, and they climbed inside, determined to find Mr. Hollis's gallery. As the vehicle rattled over cobblestones, Miss Marple watched the rain blur the newly golden leaves and reflected on the evolving web of possibility. An art dealer, a mysterious GP, and a legend of an enchanted mirror. The glass button might have been a witness to more than one hand, leading past Mrs. Pease's confession into fresh enigma. Bill laced his fingers together on his lap. Jane, if Mr. Hollis confirms that Evelyn was not the only one to handle those buttons, what then? We risk unraveling the one confession we have felt certain of. Miss Marple leaned back, her expression serene. We must seek truth wherever it lies. If evidence emerges that Evelyn acted hastily to protect someone else, we must be ready to follow that path. But for now, she sits in custody, and within a matter of hours, her plea will be heard. Beyond that, the question is whether there was someone who wished to ensure her downfall, planting seeds both of evidence and misdirection. Perhaps someone who desired Carrick's researcher feared what he uncovered. The taxi slowed to a halt outside a terraced townhouse marked Hollis & Co. Fine Art and Collectibles. The window displayed a delicate silver necklace and some small paintings, but no velvet buttons in sight. Bill paid the driver, and they stepped into the gallery's foyer, where a young assistant stood, eyebrows raised at their sodden coats. Good afternoon, Miss Marple said. We seek Mr. Hollis. It concerns a commission for glass buttons, similar to those made by Mr. Gilchrist of St. Mary Mead. Are you aware of any such order in the past month? The assistant led them through a narrow corridor to a back office where Mr. Hollis himself sat behind a polished mahogany desk. He was mid-30s, with neatly trimmed hair and intellect-trimmed glasses. He glanced up, offering a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. Miss Marple, Mr. Bantry, to what do I owe this visit? He set aside a stack of auction catalogs and steepled his fingers. Miss Marple nodded. Mr. Hollis, I understand you requested a pair of glass buttons from Mr. Gilchrist recently. He recalled that he sold a single set to you for a lady whose initials were GP. Did you order these for Mrs. Pease? Mr. Hollis's expression flickered. I believe you have been ill-informed. I purchased the buttons for a client named Gabrielle Pennington, a young heiress from Bath. I was to assist her in restoring a velvet cloak that belonged to her grandmother. He folded his hands and deliberately measured his words. Mrs. Pease had no involvement in that transaction. Bill frowned. Gabrielle Pennington, are you certain? Mrs. Pease might use a pseudonym. Mr. Hollis clasped his chin. I assure you, I recorded the full name in the ledger and saw the young woman in person. She came to my gallery, accompanied by her aunt. The transaction took place nearly 2 weeks ago, well before Theodore Carrick's death. Miss Marple frowned. Then, if Mrs. Pease had this button, and Gabrielle Pennington had a similar set, there may well be 2 sets of buttons in circulation, one for Carrick's coat, one for the Pennington cloak. Did Pennington's cloak also bear the same etched pattern? Hollis's lips tightened. Quite so. But since the pattern was mass-produced from a popular Murano design, Gilchrist created 2 identical sets on separate orders. He leaned back. I find it troubling that my innocent involvement now appears to entangle me in a criminal investigation. Miss Marple inclined her head. I understand. We simply wish to ensure that we track all possible avenues, do you? Know where Gabrielle Pennington resides?" He handed over a card. "Her family estate is the Cedars, on the outskirts of Bath. I can give you directions." Miss Marple folded her shawl around her shoulders. "Thank you, Mr. Hollis. Your candor is appreciated. We may call upon you, or Ms. Pennington, if need be." As they left the gallery, a slender woman in a violet dress and wide-brimmed hat waited by the curb. She watched them with pale, calculating eyes. Miss Marple caught her gaze and offered a polite nod, which the stranger returned before stepping into a waiting carriage. "Gabrielle Pennington," Bill murmured, recognizing her name from the card. "See how she paling turns from us almost, as though she fears our questions." Miss Marple studied the carriage as it rolled away. Yet if she purchased her buttons over 2 weeks ago, she has no direct connection to Carrick's coat. Still, I sense a shadow here, perhaps, a desire to remain unseen, as though someone else used her purchase to cloak their own designs. A sudden roll of thunder echoed over Bath's skyline, and Miss Marple drew in a breath. "We have a new lead, but for now we must return to St. Mary Mead. The trial approaches, and with it the unmasking of more than one truth. Let us go." As they wound their way back to the taxi stand, Miss Marple tucked her satchel back into place, the velvet-lined box nestled within. The glass button remained a silent witness, its facets hidden beneath the cloth. Rain began to fall in earnest, beads striking the pavement like soft taps, but within her mind a clearer understanding was taking shape. Somewhere between Bath and their own village lay the echoes of ambition, the refuse of ambition, discarded like shards of colored glass, waiting to reveal a pattern only she seemed poised to discern. The path ahead would be long, but the next fragments of truth had already begun to surface. Chapter 16. Echoes in St. Mary Mead. When Miss Marple and Bill Bantry returned to St. Mary Mead late that morning, the village seemed hushed under a gray sky that threatened rain. Word of Mrs. Peace's arrest in Bath had preceded them, arriving by telephone and notes pinned to the church door. Conversations in the market, hushed and urgent, had dwindled to a solemn hush as villagers contemplated that a relative outsider, the well-spoken professor from Bath, had carried out a cunning, calculated crime against a fellow scholarly stranger. Theodore Carrick. Miss Marple paused at her own garden gate to remove her gloves and straighten her skirt. Bill Bantry lingered at her side, his brow furrowed with thought. "It's all too quiet," he murmured, echoing her own sense of unease. One arrest, and suddenly the energy of the village feels deflated, as though everyone is holding its breath. She nodded. Her gaze swept over the neat hedges and the chill dew that clung to the roses. That is often the way. People become wounded by anxiety and crave reassurance. They assume that because Mrs. Pease has confessed, the story ends. Yet, in my experience, when a confession is made under such duress, there are echoes of truth still waiting in the margins. I must check on Gilchrist's shop. I have a notion that although Mrs. Pease admitted planting the button, she might not have been the only one to handle it. There is something about the pattern of spall on the glass that I find incongruous. Bill nodded. "Let me accompany you. I could use a walk, and we can go by Colonel Bantry's. He wanted to speak with you about the funeral arrangements for Mr. Carrick." Miss Marple tucked the button back into its box. "Of course, it is as well to offer what solace we can, though I suspect the Bantries bear enough to occupy their thoughts without our urging. They crossed the lane toward Bantry House, where Colonel Bantry and his wife were awaiting them on the stone portico. The butler opened the door, and they entered a small foyer infused with the scent of chrysanthemums. Inside the drawing room, Colonel Bantry stood by a gleaming sideboard, his fatigued eyes fixed on her as she entered. Mrs. Bantry sat in a wing-back chair, draped in a knitted shawl, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Jane, Dolly Bantry," said, rising as Miss Marple approached. "Thank you for coming." Miss Marple bowed in acknowledgment. Glancing to Bill, "We wished to offer any assistance we can for the funeral and to share what remains of Carrick's belongings." She motioned toward a small leather satchel Bill carried, its buckles polished. "Bill has retrieved Mr. Carrick's journals and letters from the curate at the church, along with an envelope marked private, to be opened only by VH. A curious notation. Colonel Bantry's forehead creased. VH. That must be an initial. Rarely did Carrick entrust his personal effects to anyone. This mystery deepens rather than closes. Are there any clues that might help us understand why a man so reserved would draw such violence upon himself? Bill set the satchel on the low table and unfastened it, pulling out a stack of aging leather-bound notebooks. He began keeping these journals during his final months, it seems. They record daily entries about artifact acquisitions and correspondence with the British Museum. But there are also cryptic references, mentions of a local artifact that seemed to unsettle him, something he discovered in the village records. He leafed through to a page dated early September, which read, "I have found mention of the earthen mirror of Graythorn Manor. If the legend holds true, I must inquire further, may bear significance to my own research." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. Graythorn Manor. That estate belonged to the Crawley family before they sold it. Rumor had it the mirror vanished decades ago, but clearly Carrick believed it to be connected to his work. She laid a gentle hand on the open journal. Did he note who told him of this? A villager, perhaps one of us in St. Mary Mead. Or might it be something he read in the archives at Bath? Dolly Bantry leaned forward. "I remember him asking about the records at the church's parsonage, about old parish entries from the 18th century. It would help explain why a seemingly placid scholar like Carrick would draw the curiosity of a Bath professor." The Crawley mirror was rumored to possess powers over revelation if carried into the wrong hands. Those revelations could prove ruinous. She closed the journal gently. "We must include this in the funeral eulogy, as it contextualizes Carrick's last days. Bill, would you affix a label to these entries and send them to St. Mary Mead's archive? The vicar there would want to preserve them." Bill rose and began arranging the journals in protective cloth. Colonel Bantry watched them, his jaw set as though steeling himself. "We must also confirm that Mrs. Pease did not have any inkling of this mirror. If she knew, it might be an added motive for her to desire Carrick's downfall, greed, or rivalry." Among scholars, Miss Marple leaned back. "An excellent point. Even though she confessed to killing Carrick out of wounded pride, it is possible she learned of the mirror and sought to claim it for herself. We shall need to question her about any mention of Graythorn Manor." Dolly Bantry's eyes regained a measure of resolve. "Very well. We will include that in the investigation. For now, though, we must finalize arrangements. The funeral is set for Saturday morning at St. Mary Mead Church. The rector will conduct the service. I intend to mention Carrick's scholarly pursuit and his final discoveries in his memory." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I have some notes on the legend that may bring clarity to those unfamiliar with Crawley lore." Colonel Bantry nodded. "Thank you, Jane. Your insight has guided us since day one." He exchanged a glance with Dolly, and something unspoken passed between them, a mixture of gratitude, sorrow, and determination. After leaving Bantry House, Miss Marple and Bill set off on foot toward Gilchrist's antique shop. The sky had darkened to a slate hue, promising rain soon. Leaves rustled along the pavements. Bill said abruptly, "Do you truly think Mrs. Pease would kill for a mere button and a glimmering mirror? It seems too slender a motive." Miss Marple paused, resting a hand on the low stone wall that edged the pavement. "Bill, motives often conceal multipliers." Her pride, wounded, as she said, may have driven her to rage. But if she also coveted the mirror, believing it could solidify her reputation in scholarly society, that is an additional factor. In my mind, we cannot isolate the belladonna from the lore that haunted Carrick's final nights. His decision to pursue the mirror may have set him on a collision course with Evelyn's ambition. Bill leaned against the wall, considering, "And this mirror, do you believe it ever existed, or was it just a myth?" Miss Marple wrapped a shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Legend often arises from kernels of truth. There may have been a small ceremonial object at Greythorn Manor, once perhaps a polished brass tile used in family rituals. Over time it grew teeth in the imagination of curious minds. Whether Carrick believed it truly held supernatural power, he saw it as the crowning piece of his research. If Evelyn believed so too, grief and greed could transform from a wounded pride into lethal obsession. Around the corner, Gilchrist's shop stood open, its signs swinging idly. Through the window, shelves of tarnished silver and chipped porcelain glowed under a single lamp. Inside, Gilchrist emerged from the back room, polishing a teapot. "Miss Marple, Mr. Bantry, a surprise to see you this afternoon. What brings you all the way from Bantry House?" Miss Marple produced the velvet-lined box once more, lifting the lid to reveal the glass button. Gilchrist's eyes widened, as if recognizing it for the first time, that button so finely etched with an angular pattern. "But I cannot recall for whom I made the full set." He set down the teapot, jewelry tools clinking as he wiped his hands on his apron. "I sold several buttons from that design once to a Mrs. Arkwright of Tuckingham, and once to a Mr. Hollis in Bath. But certainly Carrick commissioned a bespoke batch, and these appeared exactly as he requested." Miss Marple gently closed the box. "I understand. There may be traces of glass, dust, or residual metal in your workshop that could help indicate if someone else handled the set recently." She tapped her finger against her chin. "Mr. Hollis, do you know who he is?" Gilchrist rubbed his chin thoughtfully, then walked to a tall cabinet where he retrieved a ledger. He opened it at a page marked September of the previous year. Running his finger down a list of names, "Hollis, yes, he was a minor art dealer in Bath. He bought a single button set on a commission for a lady, whose name he recorded as GP, but that is all I recall." He looked up, concern flitting across his face. Did you wish me to inspect my remnants for glass fragments? Miss Marple nodded. Then the only one to procure them. If any new shards or offcuts match the replaced buttons, it may shed light on who had access to the velvet coat after Carrick's death. Gilchrist went to his workbench, and, under Miss Marple's calm but watchful eye, tested my grandfather's random musings, not through him. Miss Marple inclined her head. Your help is appreciated. We shall indeed examine any correspondence you can provide. Meanwhile, one final question. Did you ever visit St. Mary Mead after receiving those buttons from Gilchrist? Perhaps to inspect the fit or adjust a hem? Gabrielle's light gray-green eyes shimmered with the memory. Yes, I traveled to St. Mary Mead 2 weeks ago, on November 3rd, to visit a friend. And how I spilled a bit of tea on the hem as we chatted. But I left by carriage to return to Bath before dusk, well before Carrick's return. At no point did I go near Brook Cottage. Bill scribbled notes carefully. Thank you. Miss Stokes's name will help us confirm your timeline. He flicked his notebook closed. Or did your tailor affix them all at once? Gabrielle reached into her reticule and produced a small, velvet-lined box. Inside lay 2 glass buttons, identical to the one Miss Marple had shown her photograph of. The rest were sewn onto the front of the cloak. She tipped them gently, allowing them to catch the light, their etched, frost-like designs shining. I treasure these. They were very dear, purchased at great expense. Miss Marple accepted one with gloved fingers, examining the tiny surface under her gaze. They match exactly, yet to remain unused, you say? Gabrielle inclined her head. Yes, my tailor thought only 12 were needed to secure the front. 2 remained for decoration and were left in my possession. I have no idea how they differ from the set removed from Mr. Carrick's coat. You mentioned Miss Stokes. Is she present at St. Mary Mead now? Miss Marple asked. Indeed. She is expecting a rather significant operation and asked me to advise on some remedies. I could be there now, if you think it will help. Miss Marple considered for a moment. Yes, I believe it would be wise. If we can confirm Miss Stokes saw you and the cloak in her home, it further establishes your innocence. I will accompany you. She stood, smoothing her shawl. Gabrielle rose as well, securing the buttons in her reticule. I appreciate your willingness to vouch for me. Let us go at once. They made their way back through the house, passing beneath the silent gaze of ancestral portraits. The footman awaited them at the front door, umbrella in hand, as the rain continued its steady drum. The motor car waited on the drive, wheels glinting where puddles reflected silver drops. Facade fading in the rear-view mirror as the car wound its way through Bath's quiet streets and onto the road to St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple settled into thought. Gabrielle Pennington armed her with letters hinting at the mirror's legend. She'd seen the cloak and operated within plausible time constraints. Yet Miss Marple sensed there were still shadows lurking between the threads of truth. Somewhere, among letters and reflections, a fragment of motive remained concealed. The village lay silent under a veil of mist as they approached. Miss Stokes's cottage, neat whitewashed dwelling, set near the churchyard. Wines of green ivy clung to its walls, and the window ledges were crowded with potted cyclamen, their petals bright against the dreary backdrop. The car rattled into the lane, and Miss Marple and Bill escorted Gabrielle across the dew-damp lawn. Miss Stokes answered the door in a gray cotton dress embroidered with lavender. She offered a wan smile. A small gauze bandage covered her left wrist. Miss Pennington, Miss Marple, Mr. Bantry, what a kindness to come. Please do come in. They entered a cozy sitting room, the scent of eucalyptus and chamomile in the air. A basket of needlework lay on a side table. Miss Stokes motioned them to chairs near the hearth. I am well enough for visitors now, though the surgeon said I should not exert myself too much. I am grateful for Gabby's attention to my prescriptions. She turned to Gobber, an elderly collie resting at her feet. He tried to lap at my wrist last night, persistent fellow. Gabrielle moved to a small clothes rail where a velvet cloak hung protected by a dusting of mothballs. She lifted it gently by the collar and reclaimed the 2 buttons Miss Marple had seen. I wore this here on November 3rd, as I recall. I left the cloak with you for a fitting adjustment. How did you recall the exact date, Miss Marple? Miss Stokes's pale eyes flickered. It was the evening before I fell ill. You came to help with my cold compresses, and I spilled tea on the hem. I remember because I was surprised by how warm and soft the lining was. Thank you. That establishes that your cloak and its buttons were present in this cottage that night. Miss Stokes sipped her tea, then nodded. Yes, she left as the lantern on the porch struck 9. I did not see her return. She gestured to the cloak. Miss Marple turned and met Gabrielle's gaze. That is most helpful. We shall need to note this precisely. She jotted in her notebook, then rose. Thank you, Miss Stokes. Your testimony will be invaluable. Gabrielle folded the cloak and draped it over her arm. I am glad to help. I do hope you find the truth soon, Miss Marple. Take care of yourself, Miss Stokes. We shall be in touch if we need anything further. They bade farewell, stepping back into the misty afternoon. The rain had eased to a light drizzle, but the air remained cold. She thought of Carrick's journals and the earthen mirrors, promise to reveal one's true nature. Gabrielle sat quietly beside her, glancing at the cloaked outline of St. Mary Mead's cottages. Do you believe that someone else might use my buttons to their own ends? She murmured. Miss Marple offered a small smile. I suspect so, Miss Pennington, but your cooperation has cleared your name. Now the question is, who knew of your order and saw an opportunity? From the pieces we have the button, the cloak, the mirrors. Lori believe there is still one fragment missing, and tomorrow I shall begin to search for it. She paused, looking ahead at the village outline. Gabrielle inclined her head, her expression one of quiet relief. Bill slid the car to a halt by Miss Marple's gate, the wheels crunching on the gravel. If there is anything I can do, anything, please let me know. Miss Marple kissed her hand to Gabrielle. You have done more than enough. Safe travels. Button glinted faintly, a remnant of a web gradually threading together. The names of Carrick, Pease, and Pennington now rested upon her mind. Somewhere in the village records, or in the family lore, whispered among gentlewomen and scholars, lay the missing piece, a key to unlock the last shadow and reveal the murderer's true accomplice, if any remained. She closed her umbrella and stepped onto the porch, her skirts brushing damp stone. The lamp in her sitting room glowed behind the curtains, and inside waited the warmth of home and reflection. With careful precision she placed the velvet-lined box on her writing desk, then took up her pen. The final chapter of this mystery was still unwritten, but now, at last, she held the quill, poised to script its conclusion. Chapter 17. Shadows at the Cedars Miss. Marple awoke the following morning to a steady patter of rain against her window pane. The gray skies of early November hung low, and the familiar garden path lay slick with fallen leaves. Yet she felt a surge of anticipation rather than melancholy. New leads had emerged late the previous evening, and she planned to pursue them without delay. Bill Bantry arrived at her gate just after 8, umbrella in hand, his face determined. Across the lane, his Aunt Dolly Bantry had sent a note expressing gratitude for Miss Marple's work and regret at missing breakfast, leaving them free to follow the trail to Bath once more. They packed a lightweight lunch, Miss Marple's knitted shawl, and the glass button still held in its velvet-lined box, then tapped on Bill's Morris Minor's rain-speckled windshield. The motor car rumbled to life, headlights casting shimmering reflections on the wet road as they set off for Bath. The drive was quieter than usual. The rain muffled the engine's whine and dulled the landscape to muted greens and browns. Miss Marple stared out at the hedgerows, lost in thought. "Bill, I cannot shake the sense that Gabrielle Pennington's involvement, however innocent, conceals something more." She purchased buttons identical to Carrick's coat without knowing his commission. Yet, if someone meant to frame Mrs. Pease, they could easily have taken Pennington's set and swapped them with Carrick's original. The question is why they bothered, instead of stealing Carrick's coat outright. Bill glanced at her, eyebrows furrowed. "So you think someone used Mrs. Pease's confession as a smokescreen, while the real puppet master lurks in the wings?" Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely. We must examine Pennington's motives, her connections, and the true provenance of those buttons." And she paused as the spire of Bath Abbey rose into view through the gloom. "We should find out if she is familiar with the legend of the earthen mirror of Greythorn Manor. If she knew of Carrick's interest, she might have acted to secure it." Bill glanced toward the window as they passed across Pulteney Bridge, the River Avon roaring beneath them. "Shall we proceed directly to the Cedars? Do you have an address?" Miss Marple consulted the small card Mr. Hollis had given them. "Yes, the Cedars lies just beyond Bathwick Hill. I believe it is owned by her uncle, Lord Pennington, though Gabrielle resides there with her aunt while Lord Pennington is abroad. We must tread carefully, an invitation might be required." They found the Cedars by mid-morning, a grand Georgian house set behind retired gates, tall yew hedges enclosed manicured lawns, their paths lined with stone urns filled with chrysanthemums. A gravel drive swept upward to a broad portico supported by Ionic columns. Rain puddled in the depressions of the drive, and the overcast sky lent a silvery tint to the limestone facade. Miss Marple and Bill ascended the stone steps, and an elderly footman answered their knock. He wore a charcoal morning coat and a white waistcoat patterned with silver thread. "Good morning," Bill began. "We are here to see Miss Gabrielle Pennington. Is she at home?" The footman paused, his gaze courteous but cautious. "Madam is indeed at home, sir. Fair warning, Pennington House is private until noon, and our mistress has no appointments until later. But if you leave a visiting card, I shall see that she receives it." Miss Marple reached into her bag and produced a small card bearing her name in neat script. "Please present this to Miss Pennington." Kindly request an audience as soon as she is available. We must speak regarding a matter of scholarly import." The footman took the card and inclined his head. "Very good, madame. I shall deliver this at once. If Miss Pennington is willing, she will join you here in the drawing-room. If not, I shall inform her that you remain awaiting her decision." He bowed and retreated down the steps. Bill felt the tension in the moist air. That was polite, but I fear she may be reluctant to meet, given the circumstances. Miss Marple folded her hands, gazing at the front doors. "We have evidence that she purchased a set of glass buttons matching Carrick's commission. That alone is tenuous. But we also know she claims no knowledge of Carrick's coat or his fate. If she resisted meeting us, it might suggest she fears our questions. But I hold little concern. In my experience, ladies of breeding often cannot conceal surprise when confronted with an unexpected query." They lingered beneath the portico until a second footman approached with a silver tray bearing 2 porcelain cups of tea and a plate of carefully iced walnut cakes. "Lady Pennington's compliments," he said, "and she bids you wait in the drawing-room should you choose. She shall join you momentarily." He placed the tray on a small iron table and returned to the house without another word. Miss Marple and Bill exchanged glances, then stepped past the broad portals into a cool, high-ceilinged vestibule. Elaborate plaster moldings framed the doorway, and crystal chandeliers dangled like icicles overhead. The footman led them through a pair of ornately carved doors into the drawing-room, a rectangular space lined with bookcases, Persian rugs, and tall windows draped with velvet curtains. Oil paintings of ancestral Penningtons looked down from mahogany-lined walls. A grand piano sat silently near the bow window, its cover closed as though awaiting familiar fingers. They seated themselves on a pair of rose-patterned settees facing each other, tea and cakes on a gilt wooden table between them. Miss Marple permitted herself a small moment to survey the room, the gleaming silver tea service, the fresh blooms of white peonies on a side table, and the distant view of snow-dusted hills through the rain-speckled window. After a minute, the drawing-room doors opened, and a tall young woman entered. Her auburn hair was gathered into a loose chignon, and her gray-green eyes glinted with polite reserve. She wore a tailored brown tweed skirt-suit, trimmed with velvet piping, and a simple string of pearls at her throat. At her approach, the footman silently departed, leaving her alone with Miss Marple and Bill. "Miss Marple, Mr. Bantry," she said, offering a gracious nod. "I apologize for the delay. My aunt's solicitude for my comfort ran to wishing me a midday repast before seeing any guests." She managed a faint, rueful smile. "Tea is welcome, thank you." She sank into a side chair beside the trumpet. "Of flowers." Bill inclined his head. "Thank you for seeing us, Miss Pennington. We shall be brief. It concerns your recent purchase of a set of glass buttons from Mr. Gilchrist. We understand you acquired them for a velvet cloak, but we need to ask whether you had any knowledge of Mr. Carrick or his own commission." Gabrielle's gaze flicked to the silver teapot. She poured herself a cup, taking time before answering. "I have never met Mr. Carrick, nor did I know of his owning a velvet gallery. I commissioned the buttons in mid-October purely as a decorative touch for a cloak passed down to me when my grandmother died. I was under the impression they were a modern reproductions of Moreno styles, not unique items." She sipped her tea, setting the cup back on its saucer. I did not learn of Mr. Carrick's death until yesterday's paper. Miss Marple folded her hands. That may well be true. However, the glass button found in St. Mary Mead matched the pattern you purchased, as did the fragment discovered in Brook Cottage. We have reason to believe that some of your buttons, or a near-identical set, were used to replace those on Mr. Carrick's coat, possibly to conceal who removed his originals and when. Gabrielle's expression eased, though a glimmer of concern shadowed her eyes. I see. I assure you, I had nothing to do with that. I purchased only those buttons described in the invoice from Mr. Hollis, and I delivered them to my tailor in Bath. If someone used my set to frame Mrs. P's, I was as surprised as anyone. Bill leaned forward. Can you account for your whereabouts on the night of October 30th? You told us you only learned of Carrick's death yesterday, but we must confirm you had no opportunity to be present at Brook Cottage. Gabrielle set her teacup on the table and met his gaze steadily. Certainly. On October 30th, I attended a dinner at Lord Bathwick's house, arriving there at 7:30. I remained until 10:30, at which time I took a carriage home. My aunt and I had prepared for the following day's society meeting, so I spent the rest of the evening reviewing my grandmother's letters and inspecting my late grandfather's charted map of Graythorn Manor, though only out of idle curiosity, not research. My aunt can confirm my presence until midnight. She inclined her head. I had no reason to visit Bath that night beyond my dinner invitation. Miss Marple considered her carefully. As an heiress, your reputation is paramount, Miss Pennington. You would not risk being seen near St. Mary Mead without careful thought. But your mention of your grandfather's map of Graythorn Manor intrigues me. Mr. Carrick mentioned that mirror in his journals. Did you, in fact, know of the Earth Mirror's legend? Gabrielle's brows knit. My grandfather was an amateur historian. He collected strange artifacts and told me a tale of Graythorn Manor, that a polished metal panel once hung in the dining hall, believed to reflect not just one's image but one's true nature. I always thought it a romantic myth. I never believed anyone would hunt for it seriously, especially not in this day and age. She paused, taking a breath. I enclose many letters with my grandmother's papers. If you wish, I can show you the map and some correspondence that speak of the mirror. But I swear to you, I had no ill intent toward Mr. Carrick if he sought to confirm its existence. I only learned of it through parts of it to blackmail him or to draw him into the ruin alone. Reverend Clark frowned. Curate Preto kept his papers in the manor's chaplain house, which burned down in 1903. Some of his records were salvaged and brought here. Follow me to the vestry. They walked through the church interior, past pews dusted with sun-patched light, and into the vestria-cluttered room of dark wood and worn leather volumes. Reverend Clark unlocked a heavy oak cabinet and withdrew a small leather-bound ledger marked Prito's Parish Notes, 1865 to 1874. He laid it on a table and opened to an entry dated April 5, 1868. Received a commission from Lord Graythorn to ensure that the Miralong believed to heed God's judgment rather than man's admiration be hidden from rapacious collectors. The final panel, now polished, rests within the sanctuary alcove. Should truth's reflection bring peril, whosoever discovers it must promise to return it to God's care. Miss Marple gleaned from his inflections that the vicar found the passage unsettling. Sanctuary alcove that might refer to the chapel's eastern niche now collapsed. No other panel would hide the mirror so well. Yet Prideaux's journal warns, the mirror reveals secrets too potent for mortal ken. Could someone cure it? Prideaux's descendant perhaps believe the mirror held power over Carrick's mind. Reverend Clark placed a gentle hand on Miss Marple's arm. I once heard that Prideaux had a nephew, Gideon Prideaux, who studied at Oxford before disappearing from records. If any family line retained access to Graythorne's secrets, it would be him or his heirs. Gideon was rumored to dabble in occult study. Miss Marple nodded. Then our next step is to identify any living Prideaux heir or associated historian. If they, too, sought the mirror, they may have confronted Carrick before his death. Bill folded his arms. So far, we have Mrs. Pease's confession for the belladonna, and now evidence that someone else coveted the mirror. It seems Carrick's death was the product of multiple motives: jealousy, ambition, and hidden obsession. We must piece them together to understand the whole. Reverend Clark stood, pressing the ledger closed. I shall provide you with a list of Prideaux family names mentioned in these notes. With luck, one may correspond to someone still living. Miss Marple bowed her head in gratitude. Thank you, Reverend. Your assistance has been indispensable. With these fragments, and now the ledger's references, we approach the heart of Carrick's tragedy. They stepped outside into a weak slant of afternoon light. The church bells tolled 1/2 hour, their sonorous echoes drifting lazily across the mist-laced village. Miss Marple paused, looking toward Brook Cottage beyond the trees. In her satchel lay shards of a mirror that once held more than a reflection. In her mind, she saw an intricate tapestry of desire and despair woven through every participant: Mrs. Pease, Gabrielle Pennington, Curate Prideaux's heirs, and the learned but vulnerable Theodore Carrick. Tomorrow she would begin contacting Prideaux relations. She would re-examine Mrs. Pease's statements in light of the mirror's true significance, and she would prepare to confront the final shadow in the tapestry. For now, though, she let the autumn breeze carry away the weight of discovery, even as the mirror's fragments in her satchel glowed with silent promise. In St. Mary Mead, the echoes of old secrets and new revelations mingled like the shifting mists around the churchyard, reminding her that, in a world of subtle truths, nothing remains hidden forever. Chapter 18. Secrets in the Ruins. The morning air felt unusually sharp as Miss Marple and Bill Bantry threaded their way through St. Mary Mead's winding lanes. A cold wind had risen overnight, loosening clusters of copper leaves from the hedgerows, and stirring the mist along the low stone walls. Bill drove the Morris Minor at a cautious pace, its wheels crunching against frost-hardened gravel. Miss Marple sat beside him, clutching Carrick's leather-bound journals in her lap, her gaze fixed on the elliptical horizon, where, beyond the village, lay the rolling pastures leading to Graythorne Manor's long-abandoned estate. Today's destination was the ruins of Graythorne itself, its skeletal walls half swallowed by ivy and time. Carrick's final journal entries hinted that the earthen mirror, indeed it existed, lay hidden somewhere amid those deserted rooms. Miss Marple had resolved that, if she was to understand the chain of motives underlying his death, She must see the place for herself. Bill glanced at her, noting her calm yet determined expression, although the day's chill seemed to nip at their faces. He felt a surge of gratitude for her company. She made the path both purposeful and bearable. "Do you recall the journal entry from September?" Bill asked, turning slightly so that he could glance at Miss Marple. Carrick mentioned finding a cryptic reference to a hidden panel behind the eastern wall of the ruins' central hall, something he called the Keeper's Threshold. He wrote that he believed the earthen mirror might be concealed there. Miss Marple nodded as the carriage made a sharp turn onto a narrow country lane. Yes, he described how an 18th-century curate, Prideaux GP, in his correspondence had once overseen the manor's chapel. Perhaps that is the same GP whose initials Gabrielle Pennington used in her button order. It would explain how Carrick knew to look there. If Miss Pennington's grandfather's map held any credence, GP might have consulted for years over the mirror's placement. Bill raised an eyebrow. "So you think this Prideaux was more than just a footnote in Carrick's research, possibly the one who planted his first clue?" Miss Marple's eyes glimmered. It would fit. A family of local landholders, a curator, and an heirloom believed to hold supernatural lore, at least psychologically influence. Yet whether Prideaux sought the mirror for good reasons or darker ones remains uncertain. We must find evidence among the ruins. By mid-morning, they reached a narrow gravel drive that curved upward to a low stone folly, marking the entrance to Greythorn Manor, a battered iron gate. Its finials, oxidized to green, stood ajar. Beyond it, a stretch of overgrown lawn led to crumbling stone pillars folded by climbing ivy. Bill parked the car near a leaf-strewn path that led into a tangle of gnarled oaks and hawthorns. A sudden gust of wind rattled the trees overhead, scattering a cascade of leaves. Miss Marple shivered beneath her knitted shawl, then slipped on her gloves and shouldered Carrick's journals. "Let us proceed carefully," she said. "The path is uneven, and the walls themselves may be unstable. But if we reach the central hall, we should find the marks he mentioned." They stepped onto the fine gravel and marched onward, each crunch underfoot echoing like a metronome in the damp hush. After a few minutes, the canopy of trees gave way to the open space before the manor's remains, arches of collapsed stone, gaping windows once filled with glass, now empty and raw. The wind buffeted against the half-roofed structure, carrying a faint scent of decay and old mortar. Inside, the ground was strewn with rubble and dry leaves. A handful of brittle ivy clung to interior walls, and tiny ferns grew in crevices where rain had pooled. Miss Marple paused by the lintel of a wide archway. "This must be the entrance to the great hall. Note how the stone floor slopes slightly toward the west, consistent with Carrick's description of a hidden channel under the floorboards." She set down her journals and knelt to brush aside leaves. Beneath the debris lay a series of polished flagstones, one of which bore a faint line almost imperceptible to the naked eye. She ran a gloved fingertip along the line, feeling the hairline fracture in the rock. Bill knelt beside her. "You see it, too. The seam is too precise to be natural. If this flagstone were hinged or could be lifted, it might conceal an entrance below." Miss Marple nodded. "Very well observed. But Carrick mentioned something about a panel in the eastern wall, not the floor. Let us follow his instructions to the letter." She rose and consulted the journal's yellowed pages, reading aloud from the northern arch. Count 14 paces east until you reach the first column of Doric stone. At its base, set 2 steps off to the right. There, you will find 2 carved birds perched on a stone shelf. Behind that shelf, a concealed panel holds the mirror's fragments. Thus did Curate Preto describe. Bill counted silently as they strode beneath the phantom eaves of the roof. 1 or 2, 3. The great hall was roughly 40 paces from the entrance to the north wall, its columns worn but still standing as monolithic sentinels. At the first column on the east side, they halted. Miss Marple held up a finger for silence, and a faint drip of water echoed from somewhere deeper in the ruin. She bent to examine the column's base, then traced the stone's surface with a gloved hand until she felt a small protrusion shaped like the carved head of a bird. "Here," she murmured. Beneath the bird's beak, the stone jutted out slightly, forming a shallow ledge. She pressed lightly, and the ledge gave way with a soft click. A vertical panel in the wall, roughly the size of a shoebox, swung open, revealing a dark hollow. Beyond, Bill shone his torch into the recess. A fine layer of dust coated an assortment of silvered fragments, some shards reflecting the beam as though on fire. Miss Marple crouched beside him. "These must be the fragments of the earthen mirror," she whispered. She leaned forward and carefully lifted a fragment from the bottom of the shelf, brushing away gray dust to reveal a polished surface etched with a pattern of concentric circles. The glass was thicker than ordinary mirror glass, more like a polished metal glazed over with silver. Bill shone the light on another fragment higher above, and Miss Marple's eyes widened. "Look, there is pollen adhering to this piece. Not gardenia pollen, it is linden, from the lime trees that once shaded the manor's orchard. Carrick or Preto may have left it there intentionally." She gently brushed the fragment clean with a corner of her handkerchief. "The linden pollen suggests the mirror sat here uncovered when the trees bloomed, most likely in late May. That would coincide with Carrick's arrival in spring last year. He may have uncovered the mirror then, recorded its presence in his journal, and returned to Bath to plan further excavations." Bill looked around, suddenly apprehensive that someone else might discover the fragments. If someone else learned of this location, say Curate Preto, or a descendant might, they have taken some shards before Carrick arrived. Miss Marple placed the shard back on the ledge. "Possibly. But what concerns me is that Carrick intended to reassemble the mirror to locate its final panel, which he believed lay hidden deeper beneath the hearthstones. But before he could return, someone took the majority of fragments, perhaps threatening him with the loss of the discovery." She closed the panel with a soft click and rose. "We must retrieve these fragments carefully, clean them, and store them for analysis. But we also need to find out who else knew of this panel. Curate Preto died in 1874, but his papers might still exist in the church archives. If someone from his line, perhaps a priest or historian, knew of the mirror's presence, they could have sold the location or pursued Carrick for their own gain." Bill helped her to her feet. "Then next, we should visit the vicar and search the parish records. But for now, let us collect what we can from here and proceed back to the village." They worked in silence. Miss Marple carefully gathered the larger fragments into a cloth-lined canvas satchel. Bill retrieved the smaller pieces, wrapping them in layers of fabric from his handkerchief. The light from the torch revealed a faint scrawl near the edge of one shard letters that at first glance looked like a date, 18 for 68, likely meaning April 18th, 1868, the date Prideaux first concealed the mirror. The rest of the etching was obscured by age and tarnish. Satisfied, they closed the panel and memorized its location. Another gust of wind rattled the rafters, and the ruined hall seemed to exhale a sigh of relief, as though it had yielded its most secret contents. Stepping outside into the watery daylight, Miss Marple took a deep breath. The shards in their satchel felt heavy with significance. Back in the village, they entered St. Mary Mead's churchyard, where the vicar in charge, Reverend Sebastian Clark, was busy trimming the roses near the lich gate. He looked up as they approached, wiping dirt from his hands. "Miss Marple, Mr. Bantry, thank you for coming. I trust your journey to Greythorn was fruitful." Miss Marple offered a thin smile. She produced the cloth-wrapped fragments and laid them gently on a nearby stone bench. Reverend Clark's eyes widened as he recognized the etched patterns. "My word," he said softly. "Those must be from the mirror of which Curate Prideaux often wrote. I have heard tales that he hid it during the Civil War, fearing desecration by but no one believed it truly endured the centuries." Bill stepped forward. "We found them in a secret panel behind the eastern column. It confirms Carrick's hypothesis. The mirror was his obsession, but our concern now is how it connects to his death. Could someone have else took the mirror's fragments? Likely, after Carrick's initial inquiry in May, that person may also have given Carrick the impression he could trust them." Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. "Then we must identify Ms. Jennings in Devon and perhaps secure her aunt's papers before tomorrow's hearing. Do we have a way to reach her presently? I delivered this to the post this morning. If she responds promptly within 24 hours, we may glean her recollections. In the meantime, I have discovered that Horace Prideaux's wife, Lydia, remarried in 1912 to a Reverend Conwy and had a son, Alfred Conwy. Letters from Lydia, who recalled writing to her brother in Canada about the mirror's significance." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "The Prideaux-Conwy branch." "Yes, my cousin Mary Conwy lives in Trowbridge. She inherited some of the old family papers, including diaries. I recall the family legend said Horace's wife burned her husband's final letters before she died, fearing their scandalous revelations. But perhaps that was only half the truth." Miss Marple steepled her fingers. "Then Mary Conwy may have preserved some diaries or letters that Lydia Joyce Conwy did not destroy. And if any entries reference Carrickor, a woman named Evelyn Pease traveling with knowledge of Greythorn, they will be damning evidence. I propose we send for her retrospectively now, while requesting that Ms. Jennings copy any relevant Prideaux papers to hand-deliver to us." Inspector Peters rose, signaling an end to the meeting. "Mrs. Pease's hearing tomorrow focuses on her act of poisoning without overshadowing the larger mystery. Colonel, if you would contact Mary Conwy in Trowbridge, we may have a breakthrough by late afternoon." Colonel Bantry stood and nodded. "I shall do so immediately." He reached for his hat. "Thank you all. Jane, your counsel has been invaluable." Miss Marple bowed her head. "We walk a long path still, but each discovery brings us closer to truth." She glanced at Bill. "Shall we return to my cottage to await any word from Devon?" Bill offered his arm. "Let us do so. I believe that, by evening, we may illuminate the final silhouette in this tapestry." Late that afternoon, Miss Marple sat in the warm glow of her sitting room, idly stirring a cup of herbal tea. Bill paced by the hearth, papers clutched in his hand. The rain had returned, pattering against the leaded glass. A telegram lay unopened on the desk, likely from Ms. Jennings in Devon, but Bill seized it with a small flush of excitement. "Jane, here is the wire from Ms. Jennings. Found Aunt Ida's diaries. They mention Carrick's visit and refer to a late-night visitor in October, but no name. Photocopies en route by post. Will deliver originals Monday. Margaret Jennings." Miss Marple's eyes glowed. Then, even before reading, "We know Ida Prideaux, witness store, learned of Carrick's activities at Graythorne, and likely commented on that October visit. Journal entries for that day, October 30th, so we can compare what Ida wrote." Bill returned with Carrick's journal, opening to the relevant page. He wrote, "I received a letter from Miss Prideaux's niece Margaret Jennings refusing to release family papers until she speaks with me. Tonight, should her solicitor prevent access, I shall continue my research in solitude." That line suggests he expected to meet Margaret Jennings. Miss Marple tapped her spoon on the rim of her teacup, thinking, yes, if Margaret Jennings prevented Carrick from obtaining her aunt's diaries, he may have left empty-handed. That evening, he returned to Brook Cottage, perhaps emboldened to search the ruins again. If someone realized Carrick paused to write that line, they might have intercepted him on his return from Bath rather than Graythorne and forced a confrontation. Bill frowned. So someone knew his schedule, his plan to call on Jennings, then followed him back to St. Mary Mead, intercepted him while he passed through the village, and lured him into his study under false pretenses. That fits with his locked room scenario. The poison could be placed moments before he drank his tea. He leaned forward. In light of Ida's diaries, perhaps she saw a stranger that evening, someone she recognized but withheld name. We must read her account. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. Indeed, with Ida's diaries and the photocopies from Ms. Jennings, we can piece together who met Carrick that night. It may not have been Mrs. Pease at all, though she administered the poison earlier and set the stage. She paused, gazing at the brass clock, 4:45. Once the photocopies arrive, we shall know whom to confront at tomorrow's hearing for Carrick's poisoning. For now, Bill, make the fire cozy. We shall await these documents and ready ourselves for a final resolution. As snow began to drift from the sky in early dusting upon St. Mary Mead's rooftops, Miss Marple felt a renewed reassurance that each thread investigated had drawn them closer to the true heart of the matter. The mirror's fragments rested, safe within the satchel. The Prideaux lineage's secrets were poised to be revealed. And the final puzzle, who delivered Carrick into Mrs. Pease's poisoned tea, lay close at hand. In the last glow of the day, she leaned back, confident that by dawn the village would know not only who had killed Carrick, but why and how. The secrets of Graythorne. Chapter 19. The Prideaux connection. A week had passed since Miss Marple and Bill Bantry uncovered the hidden panel at Graythorne Manor and retrieved the earthen mirror's scattered fragments. The brittle autumn air had grown colder, and St. Mary Mead wore the stillness of an aggrieved hush. The villagers whispered among themselves about the strange circumstances that had led first to Carrick's poisoning and then to the revelation of a centuries-old secret chamber. Now, even Carrick's death, so neatly blamed on Mrs. Peace's wounded pride, no longer satisfied, for it had become evident that something far older than personal jealousy lay at the heart of these events, a legacy of the Prideaux family, spanning back to curate Gideon Prideaux and his cryptic promise to hide the mirror where all truth would find its disquiet. Miss Marple sat at her writing desk in the oak-paneled sitting room of her cottage, surveying the list of Prideaux descendants that Reverend Clark had provided. The pale morning light poured through the lace curtains, falling upon bundles of handwritten notes and a small pile of Carrick's journal pages. Bill Bantry leaned nearby over the hearth, examining a single fragment of the mirror in a makeshift lightbox, traced carefully along its edges with a gloved fingertip between them. A small brass clock ticked insistently toward 10 o'clock, a time Miss Marple associated with that fateful call to Mrs. Pease. She folded her knitting shawl around her shoulders and rubbed her temples, thinking aloud to Bill. The Prideaux ledger mentions several names: Gideon's brother, Matthias Prideaux, who lodged at Oxford; Gideon's son, Horace, who served as a curate in Bath; and Horace's own son, Leopold Prideaux, who emigrated to Canada in 1892. If any heir remained in or near St. Mary Medore, even in Bath, we might find someone who knew of the mirror's power, or at least its location. Reverend Clark noted that Horace died unexpectedly in 1910, but that Leopold sent occasional letters back to Bath. It is possible that one of Leopold's American descendants returned to England or maintained correspondence about Graythorne. Bill tapped the fragment gently. The pollen we found on this piece was linden. That suggests the mirror stayed hidden in its original place until the lime trees flowered, sometime in May. Carrick, of course, uncovered it then, but the intervening years would have allowed local Prideaux descendants to know where to look. Perhaps someone visited Graythorne in the spring and removed part of the mirror, disposing of it in Carrick's path to implicate him. It seems a roundabout way to claim a family heirloom. Miss Marple nodded. A simpler motive might be that Prideaux or his heirs believed the mirror could reveal things best left unspoken: sins, secrets, misdeeds. If someone suspected Carrick was too curious, they might have feared what he would do with that knowledge. Removing the mirror and framing him more frightening him would ensure it never saw the light of day again. She rose and retrieved Carrick's last journal entry from her desk. Here, on October 29th, he writes, "I have learned that Horace Prideaux's great-grandson, a Mr. Leopold Prideaux, resides in Bath. He may hold the key to the mirror's survival. Tomorrow I will attempt to contact him. Should the mirror remain intact, I will secure its fragments and undertake their restoration." He never wrote again. That entry, written the day before his death, suggests he believed Leopold could help. But if Leopold was no longer alive, perhaps he, too, passed on. Then the heirs might lie elsewhere. We must see whether Leopold's line returned to Bath, or perhaps a daughter or nephew remained. Shall we consult the Bath Registry Office to trace Prideaux births and deaths? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, and we should also speak with Mr. Hollis. He might have encountered letters or references to Prideaux when working on Gabrielle Pennington's order. She, after all, said her grandfather's map referenced Curate Prideaux's clues. If that map is genuine, then perhaps it includes notes in the margin. possibly a hidden family shorthand that points to an address here in Bath. Let us begin with Reverend Clark's instructions to visit the registrar's office in the Guildhall. "Bill, would you fetch the car? I will prepare my notes." An hour later, they were seated in the stern, lamplit office of the Bath Registry. The clerk on duty, a bespectacled gentleman with a calm demeanor, produced a large folio of registers from a tall oak cupboard. Miss Marple, poring over the volumes, by candlelight flipping between baptismal entries, marriage records, and burial registers. Bill sat beside her, jotting names in a small notebook. Horace Predody, April 4th, 1910. St. Mary Church, Bath. Leopold Predody, March 12th, 1870. Bath, D. October 18th, 1950. Windsor, Ontario, Canada. But an unexpected entry caught Miss Marple's eye. IDM Predody, July 9th, 1902. Bath, M. Thomas W. Gier, August 21st, 1925. Residence, 14 Milsom Street. She tapped the ledger softly. "Bill, look here. It seems Horace had a daughter, Ida, born in 1902, meaning she would now be 82 years old. But her marriage entry places her in Bath as late as 1925. If she remained in Milsom Street, she could easily have inherited the family papers, perhaps including Gideon Predo's journal or maps." She made a note. "Thomas Gier may also have known of the mirror. Let us see if we can find out where 14 Milsom Street might be today." Bill studied the address. "That's near Bath Abbey. If she never moved, she might have been living there, or a descendant might still hold the leases. I'll go ask the building superintendent if he knows of any Predo or Gier tenants on that street. You continue searching for any other Predo connections in the registers." Miss Marple nodded, resuming her search. Meanwhile, Bill rose and left the office, stepping into the narrow Guildhall corridor to uncover the fate of 14 Milsom Street. He knocked on the superintendent's door and quickly discovered that the property had been converted 2 decades earlier into offices. Yet the superintendent recalled an elderly Mrs. Gier, who had rented a small first-floor apartment until her death in 1991. Her niece, a Ms. Margaret Jennings, inherited the lease but moved to a coastal town in Devon shortly thereafter. The superintendent suggested, if they wished, they might write to Ms. Jennings to request any relevant family papers. Returning to Miss Marple, Bill whispered, "It seems there is still hope that the Predo lineage continued, at least through Ida. Mrs. Gier's niece may hold letters or diaries. The question is, would she respond, or has family lore died with her?" Miss Marple leaned back, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. If Ms. Jennings cherished her aunt's memories, she might treasure any historical records. It is worth attempting to contact her, Bill. But in the meantime, let us see what else the registers yield. She continued flipping through pages, finding a curious footnote. Horace Predo, 1909, vicar of St. James's, Trowbridge, no marriage record. Could Horace's widow have remarried, producing other children? We may need to trace that branch as well. Bill scribbled new names and dates. By tomorrow, we will have letters drafted to both Ms. Jennings and the local historian society in Trowbridge. But for now, shall we return to St. Mary Mead? It is nearly midday, and I believe Inspector Peters wanted to meet to discuss Mrs. Peace's upcoming hearing. Miss Marple gathered her notes, and they left the Guildhall steps echoing beneath the stone arches. The midday sun had broken through, illuminating Bath's golden streets in a warm glow. Yet Miss Marple's mind was already shifting to deeper currents. How the mirror's fragments, once whole, might reveal truths more damning than Carrick's belated journal. Back in St. Mary Mead's quiet tea-room, Inspector Peters, Colonel Bantry, and Mrs. Bantry were seated at a polished oak table, the porcelain teacups poised between them like small buoys afloat on sea-green tea. Miss Marple and Bill arrived, exchanging solemn nods. The Colonel offered his guest seat, and Mrs. Bantry placed a plate of freshly baked scones before Miss Marple, her expression one of anxious relief. "Jane," Dolly began, "threads, but I confess I feel the village will not rest until this mystery Carrick's death and the mirror's legacies resolved. You will be able to shed more light on the legal questions, I trust." Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "I shall do my best. To begin, we have learned that Carrick's final entry named Horace's daughter, Ida Prideaux, as the most likely heir to the mirror's location. If she or her descendants held diaries or maps, they could confirm what Carrick believed and whether someone else seized the mirror's fragments prior to his investigation. Mrs. Pease's confession may stand for the belladonna attack, but it does not explain who truly desired the mirror or what they intended to do with it. If we can trace Ida Prideaux's papers, we might learn whether an heir sought to claim, sell, or destroy the mirror." Inspector Peters folded his arms. "We have arranged for Mrs. Pease's counsel to submit a plea of temporary insanity, given her admission of pre-induced rage. However, if additional motive emerges such as greed for the mirror, her defense will weaken. The prosecution insists on complete truth. Are you proposing evidence that exculpates her for the mirror's disappearance, but implicates others?" Miss Marple nodded. "Precisely. By presenting the Prideaux lineage and any existing correspondence, we establish that Mrs. Pease's actions, while criminal, were not born of a desire for the mirror. She acted, Alan, in poisoning Carrick's tea, but someone down Carrick's final journal. You knew Carrick intended to visit Milsom Street and then return to Brook Cottage that night. We have evidence you intercepted him following him from Bath to St. Mary Mead and ensured he would arrive just as Evelyn Pease's tea was served." Conway's face paled. "I confess I cared for the mirror's welfare. My aunt, Ida Prideaux, charged me with protecting her inherited knowledge. When she died, she entrusted her grandnephew with all documents. I believed the mirror's existence would tempt collectors and scholars to disturb Graythorne's sanctity. Carrick threatened that, so I shadowed him, making certain he died unspoiled. Evelyn's poison did the rest." He exhaled, his shoulders slumping. "I never meant to kill him, only to keep him from pursuing the mirror. I counted on chance to deliver him into Evelyn's clutches." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. "Your compassion was misguided, but you placed Carrick in danger knowing his route, and you stole most of the mirror fragments before he learned the location at Graythorne. We found them in your satchel." She rose and picked up a faded envelope from the desk. "These letters, your aunt's journals, prove you knew he would call on Milsom Street and then return to Brook Cottage. You wrote to him, forging an urgency that led him to that fate. Exactly as your aunt warned, truth's reflection can set dangerous desires into motion." Conway sank into a chair. Bowing his head, Bill removed Carrick's final journal from the desk. "We also have your ledger entry that confirms you," mailed Carrick, the note urging him to revisit Graythorne. "When he died, you offered that note to Mrs. Pease to explain why he returned so late. You orchestrated the conspiracy of pride, secrecy, and envy." Conway drew a slow breath, closing his eyes. "I am guilty. I wanted to protect the mirror, yet I never intended murder. I set him on his path, confident he would think himself safe with Evelyn's tea. The belladonna did the deed." How swiftly everything fell apart. Miss Marple nodded, satisfaction mingling with sorrow. "Tomorrow we will present all the evidence, Mrs. Pease's confession for the poisoning, and your admission that you arranged Carrick's return to Brook Cottage with knowledge of Evelyn's intentions. The charges of conspiracy to murder will be added to the record." Bill placed Carrick's final journal on the desk beside Conway. "And we will recover the mirror's fragments you still hold. The village will determine whether such a relic should be returned to Graythorne or preserved for posterity. But first, justice must be served." Conway rose and offered his wrists to Bill's handcuffs. He did not resist. "I deserve whatever the court deems fit. I never understood how fragile the bridge between intent and outcome could be." Miss Marple patted his hand gently. "Your sin was trusting that secrecy could protect something so powerful without considering the human cost. Let us walk you to the constable's office. Tomorrow all will be laid bare." The following morning, the village gathered in hushed reverence for Theodore Carrick's funeral at St. Mary Mead Church. The pews were filled with faces both grief-stricken and relieved, for they knew the truth had been revealed. Mrs. Pease's hatred born of wounded pride, and Reverend Conway's concealment of Carrick's root. In the graveyard beyond the churchyard walls, snowflakes drifted in gentle spirals, blanketing the yew trees that stood sentinel over Carrick's resting place. Miss Marple watched from the back pew as Inspector Peters addressed the congregation. "We have learned that Carrick's demise was the result of a conspiracy. Mrs. Pease administered belladonna, and Reverend Conway manipulated his path, knowing of Carrick's plan to recover the mirror's fragments. Both individuals acted with misguided motives, pride, and misguided stewardship of a family legacy. Let us remember Carrick for his scholarly zeal and his kindness, rather than the tragedy that befell him." He closed his notebook and bowed his head in a moment of silent prayer. Joined by Colonel Bantry, Mrs. Bantry, and the rest of the mourners, Miss Marple rose as the service concluded, stepping into the cold morning air. She lingered by Carrick's newly filled grave, the white granite headstone inscribed with a single line, "Here lies Theodore Carrick, seeker of truth beyond reflection." She touched the smooth stone, remembering his tireless pursuit of the mirror. Bill stood beside her, gently placing Carrick's final journal on the grass. "Do you think the mirror will ever see daylight again?" Bill asked quietly, watching snowflakes settle on the lid of the journal. Miss Marple lifted her gaze toward the distant ruins of Graythorne, visible through the bare boughs of oaks. "The mirror's legacy belongs now to history, its fragments, consigned to the vicar's care, to be studied but never displayed. It symbolized the danger of reflection too powerful for mortal hearts. Let Carrick's quest remind us that some truths, once revealed, demand a price none can foresee." Bill nodded, closing his gloved hand over hers. Then his sacrifice was not in vain. The mirror's secret will remain protected, and we have prevented further harm." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes, and as winter's frost settles upon St. Mary Mead, let us be mindful that the human heart, like a mirror, can reveal both darkness and light. We have laid Carrick's ghost to rest, and with it the last echoes of a legacy born in secrecy centuries ago." They turned to leave the churchyard, their footsteps crunching softly in the snow. Behind them, the church bells tolled once more, lifting a final note of farewell toward the gray sky. And as the wind carried that melody across the village, a single sunbeam broke through the cloud cover, illuminating the yew trees and casting long, hopeful shadows upon the snow-dusted ground, a silent promise that even the darkest reflections may yield to the light. Chapter 20. Truth in the Mirror. Miss Marple stirred her tea with a calm deliberation, listening to the gentle hiss of rain against the window-pane. The late autumn twilight had deepened into a soft, enveloping gray that pressed against the lace curtains, blurring the outlines of St. Mary Mead's thatched roofs. In the warm glow of the sitting-room lamp, she reviewed the freshly arrived photocopies of Ida Prideaux's diaries, letting the pages fall open on her lap like the wings of a moth. Across from her, Bill Bantry sat in a high-backed chair, folding and unfolding his newspaper, as though bracing himself for the revelations within those diaries. Tomorrow would bring Mrs. Pease's final hearing, and Miss Marple meant to present a fuller account of the tragedy that had begun with a poisoned cup of tea and ended, so she hoped, with the unmasking of every hidden motive. She began to read aloud, selecting a passage dated October 30th, 1936. "I saw Mr. Carrick at Milsom Street this afternoon. When he called upon me regarding family papers, he appeared eager, almost urgent, to see the curate's notes. I apologized profusely for not having his great-grandfather's map on hand. My aunt's health has kept us from organizing our belongings. Mr. Carrick left in disappointment, yet told me he would return to Brook Cottage this evening. I could not imagine he planned to remain so late in the village. Strange how the fate of the mirror seems to haunt these records, even though I fear its power no longer resides in this world." Miss Marple folded the diary page and met Bill's gaze. Carrick called on Ida, knowing she did not have the keys to the curate's chest. She could not supply him with the original map or papers. Yet he departed, intending to return home, likely to Brook Cottage, where he would find Mrs. Pease's poisoned tea. But there is more to this entry. Ida's mention of Carrick's urgent tone. He believed the mirror's legacy remained intact. If he felt time slipping away, he may not have considered how others would perceive his late-night journey through the village. Now, read the next passage. Bill took the diary and began October 31st, 1936. A messenger arrived at dawn bearing the news of Mr. Carrick's passing. I am stunned. He was found slumped in his study, as though seized by a sudden malady. The rector has sent Aldrich to summon me, but I fear there is more to this than a simple poison. It troubles me that my own name appears in his final entries, for I cannot help but wonder if my inability to assist him played a role. Tomorrow I shall see if Mrs. P's confession holds all the truth, or if a greater sin lies concealed beneath the weight of these pages." Bill paused, his expression grave. Mrs. Pease assumed sole responsibility for the poisoning, yet Ida's words imply that Carrick's own urgency, his late-night drive through the village left him vulnerable, and she fears a greater sin, as though someone else had intended him harm before the tea. Miss Marple's voice was measured. We now have reason to suspect that someone else placed Carrick in a position where he could not avoid Mrs. P's at 10 o'clock. That person knew Carrick's route, likely gleaned from the curate's notes. But more importantly, if Ida recognized that Carrick's inquiries into the mirror put him at risk, someone wishing to protect the mirror's secret may have followed him from Milsom Street to Brook Cottage, ensuring his path passed through that study at the precise hour. We must ask, who among the Preto heirs had motive to guard the mirror's location and who still lived in or near Bath at that time? Bill rose and fetched Carrick's final journal, opening to the entry just before his death, October 30th, late evening. I have learned that Ida's aunt, Mrs. Jennings of Devonshire, may have preserved Curate Prideaux's original maps, though she insists they are locked away in a trunk I cannot access. I shall not wait. Tomorrow I return to Greythorn Manor to recover the mirror fragments before they are lost forever. If the weather holds, I will confide in no one lest the mirror's fate becomes subject to human vanity. May my perseverance not prove my undoing. Miss Marple closed the journal and regarded Bill Carrick, intended to leave Bath under the cover of dawn's fog to reach Greythorn once more. Yet he never made it. That suggests he never left Brook Cottage alive. He paused there either invited or ambushed by someone who knew he expected to visit Greythorn in the early hours. Mrs. Pease was not expecting him again. Her confession mentions she administered the poison at 10, believing him home for the evening. But the lines here reveal he planned to be away. Therefore, someone must have lured him to that isolated path between Bath and the village. Bill's face hardened. Then we must look for Prideaux descendants who knew Carrick's plans. Concealing the mirror was their family business. If any descendant learned of Carrick's final intentions, they could intercept him. Ida's diaries suggest she still lived in Bath for a time, yet she never left Milsom Street that evening. What of Horace's widow, Lydia Cronway? Did her son or grandchildren know of Carrick's calls to Bath? If they feared exposure of family secrets, they would act to protect them. Miss Marple nodded. We have identified one such grandchild, Alfred Conway's son, Edward Conway, who served as a curate in Trowbridge until 1935. He returned to Bath that summer upon his wife's passing. He resided in a small cottage near the manor, rumored to have affixed a private study to research Curate Prideaux's works. If he learned of Carrick's late-night visit to Ida's house, he could have followed Carrick unseen, intent on ensuring the mirror's hidden fragments remained undisturbed. Then, once Carrick was in Brook Cottage and vulnerable, he refrained from revealing himself and let Evelyn Pease's poison do the rest. Bill whistled softly. So, our suspect is Edward Conway. He had motive to guard ancestral secrets and knowledge of Carrick's movements. But to be certain, we need evidence that he followed Carrick from Bath to St. Mary Mead on October 30th, and we need to show that he had the means to slip into Brook Cottage to ensure Carrick entered his study at exactly 10 o'clock. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes keen. We must trace Conway's whereabouts on that night. Reverend Clark's ledger indicated he presided over an evening service at Trowbridge at 7. But Carrick left Bath for Milsom Street At 6:30 there was ample time for Conwy to meet his curate duties and then follow Carrick's carriage to the village. Moreover, Conwy's cottage was within walking distance of Brook Cottage's back gate, allowing him to step into view only after Carrick had begun down the back path. Bill set down Carrick's journal. We need to confirm Conwy's alibi and find any witness who saw him that evening. Perhaps the Trowbridge Church's vestry records list the approximate times he departed for Bath that night, and if any neighbor in Bath recalls seeing Conwy leave his cottage in the dark. Miss Marple's expression was serene yet resolute. We also need to address the mirror's fragments. Conwy could have removed most, leaving only those we found at Graith. Mislead Carrick. As for the final act, luring Carrick into Brook Cottage, Conwy need not enter. He only needed Carrick to believe he was alone, ensuring that when Carrick arrived, he found Evelyn's poisoned tea. She poured the brew, but did not kill him directly. The poison's effect required no immediate intervention. Conwy's role, then, was to manipulate Carrick's itinerary, guaranteeing he returned at that perilous hour. Bill rose, determination in his eyes. Let us retrieve Conwy's last known address. I will send a telegram to the Trowbridge vicar to confirm Conwy's departure time, and then we will question any neighbors in Bath about that evening. Meanwhile, we must present this hypothesis at Mrs. Peace's hearing in the morning to show that while her crime was real, there was a more sinister hand guiding Carrick into harm's way. Miss Marple nodded, rising to gather her shawl. Yes, but first, we must confront Edward Conwy directly. If he remains in Bath, I propose we visit his cottage tonight, under cover of darkness, to seek any remaining letters or maps that would confirm his knowledge of Carrick's plan. If we find a letter addressed to Carrick or any note instructing Carrick to return to St. Mary Mead at 10, we hold irrefutable proof. Bill placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Then let us not waste another moment. We have questions to ask and closures to bring. St. Mary Mead will sleep more peacefully once every thread is untangled. That evening, the rain had given way to a clearing sky, leaving a frost-kissed terrace where the crescent moon glowed like a slender blade above Bath's rooftops. Miss Marple and Bill stood before Edward Conwy's cottage on the fringe of the village, its windows dark and its front lamp unlit. The air felt crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and dying roses. Bill tapped lightly on the weathered door. Footsteps shuffled within, and at last the door creaked open, revealing Conwy's gaunt face framed by a thin white beard. He wore a simple gray suit and one slipper, the other foot bare. His eyes widened in recognition. Double quotes. Mrs. Pease's counsel mentioned you might come, he said, voice low and measured. I did not expect you here. Miss Marple inclined her head. Reverend Conwy, we have urgent questions regarding Mr. Carrick's passing. We believe you know more than you have admitted to the church and authorities. She stepped aside, gesturing for Bill to enter. The cottage's interior was cramped but tidy, a small writing desk littered with yellowed papers, a single oil lamp casting a warm circle of light. Conwy retreated into the shadow of the hall. I do not know what you mean, he said softly. Bill crossed the threshold, setting